Claire Whitmore came home early because she missed her husband. By the end of that night, she would wish she had stayed away one more day. The irony was almost cruel. She had spent 3 days in Boston telling herself that Alexander was probably exhausted from work. She had defended his late nights to her friends. She had excused the unanswered calls. She had even smiled when he texted her that he couldn't wait to see her when she returned. So when her conference ended a day earlier than expected, Claire didn't tell him. She wanted to surprise him. She imagined walking through the front door of their Manhattan townhouse, finding him in his study, wrapping her arms around him from behind, and watching that rare smile appear on his face. She imagined dinner together, a glass of wine, maybe a quiet conversation before bed. She imagined the husband she thought she knew. She had no idea she was walking into the night that would destroy that version of him forever. It was 11:43 p.m. when Claire unlocked the front door. The house was dark, too dark. She stepped inside quietly, still holding the small overnight bag she had carried from the airport. "Alexander?" she called softly. No answer. Claire smiled to herself. Maybe he was asleep. She placed her suitcase beside the staircase and slipped off her heels. Then she heard it. A laugh. A woman's laugh. Claire stopped breathing. For several seconds, she simply stood there in the darkness. She told herself there had to be an explanation. There was always an explanation. Maybe one of Alexander's employees was there. Maybe a business associate had come over. Maybe. Then she heard Alexander laugh. Claire's stomach dropped. She slowly looked toward the staircase. The sound had come from upstairs, from their bedroom. The room where Alexander had once whispered that she was the only woman he had ever wanted to wake up beside. The room where they had celebrated anniversaries. The room where Claire had cried silently on nights when she felt lonely but didn't know how to tell him. And now, there was another woman inside it. Claire didn't scream. She didn't throw her suitcase across the floor. She didn't run upstairs and tear the door open. She simply stood there. Because Claire had spent her entire life learning how to remain silent when something hurt. And perhaps that was why what happened next was so devastating. She walked upstairs, one step at a time. No tears, no shouting, no warning. When she reached the bedroom hallway, the door was slightly open. A warm light spilled through the gap. Claire stopped. She could hear the woman's voice clearly now. "Are you sure she won't come home?" There was a pause. Then Alexander answered, "No, she won't be back until tomorrow." Claire closed her eyes. That sentence hurt more than the laughter. Not because he had underestimated her. Because he had been so certain she wouldn't come home. So certain that he had stopped being careful. Claire slowly opened her eyes. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't allowed herself to admit for months. Alexander hadn't simply been hiding another woman. He had been living a second life. A life that existed because he believed Claire would remain exactly where he had left her. Patient, trusting, quiet. He believed she would wait. She always waited. He believed she would understand. She always understood. He believed she would forgive. He had never even asked himself whether she would. Claire placed one hand against the wall. Her wedding ring suddenly felt heavy. For 11 years, she had believed silence was one of the things that made their marriage strong. They didn't need to argue. They didn't need to explain every feeling. They could sit in the same room without speaking and still feel connected. At least, that was what Claire had told herself. But standing outside that bedroom, listening to the man she loved with another woman, she finally understood the difference between comfortable silence and emotional absence. Their silence had not been intimacy, it had been distance, and they had both been pretending not to notice. If you've ever looked at someone you loved and realized you didn't really know what was happening inside their heart, then you already understand the kind of pain Claire was about to face. Because betrayal doesn't always begin with a kiss. Sometimes it begins months earlier. It begins when conversations disappear, when questions go unanswered. When one person stops asking and the other stops explaining. When "I'm tired" becomes an excuse for every emotional distance. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in a marriage isn't a screaming argument. It's two people sitting quietly across from one another, both knowing something is wrong and neither brave enough to say it. But Claire was about to break that silence, not by screaming, not by begging, not by confronting the other woman. She was going to do something far more difficult. She was going to stop pretending. And before this story ends, you will discover why the woman Alexander thought would quietly accept his betrayal became the one person he could no longer control with silence. So before we go any further, welcome back to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. And if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because we bring you emotional love stories filled with betrayal, difficult choices, healing, and lessons about the relationships we sometimes understand only after we've lost them. And I want you to answer this question in the comments. If you were Claire, and you came home early only to discover your husband with another woman, would you confront them immediately? or would you quietly walk away and wait for the truth to reveal itself? There is no easy answer, and Claire was about to discover that sometimes the hardest decision isn't whether to leave. It's deciding whether the person who broke your trust deserves another opportunity to earn it back. But what Claire didn't know yet was that the woman in Alexander's bedroom was only the beginning. Because once Claire finally stopped protecting her husband's secrets, she was going to uncover something much deeper. A truth about their marriage, a truth about Alexander, and a truth about herself that she had spent 11 years avoiding. The woman who came home early that night wasn't the same woman who would eventually walk out of that house. And Alexander had absolutely no idea what was coming. Claire remained in the hallway. She could hear them. That was the worst part. Not seeing them. Not yet. Just hearing them. The soft murmur of Vanessa's voice. The occasional sound of Alexander responding. The quiet laughter that seemed completely ordinary to them. As though nothing about the situation was wrong. As though Claire's 11-year marriage wasn't standing on the other side of that door. Her hand remained against the wall. She didn't know how long she stood there. 30 seconds. A minute. Maybe longer. Time had become strange. The woman she had been 5 minutes earlier, the wife who had come home early because she missed her husband, was disappearing with every word she overheard. Claire could have opened the door. She could have ended the uncertainty immediately. But she didn't. Something inside her told her to wait, to listen. Not because she wanted to hear more. Because she needed to know whether the truth would come willingly. She took one quiet step closer. The door remained slightly open. Through the narrow opening, Claire could see part of the bedroom. A lamp, the edge of their bed. Alexander's jacket hanging over a chair. A woman's handbag sitting on the floor. Claire stared at the handbag. It was cream-colored, expensive. She had seen it before, not in their home. At a charity dinner 3 months earlier. Vanessa Reed. Claire remembered her standing beside Alexander. Elegant, confident, smiling. Alexander had introduced her as a consultant working with one of his investment companies. Vanessa has been helping us restructure the Chicago division, he had said. Claire had smiled politely. It's nice to meet you. Vanessa had extended her hand. Likewise. That was all. A handshake. A smile. Nothing suspicious. Nothing Claire could have pointed to. Yet now that memory returned with painful clarity. Claire remembered the way Vanessa had looked at Alexander that night. Not like an employee looking at her employer. Not exactly. It had been subtle. So subtle that Claire had dismissed it. She had dismissed many things. That was what hurt most. She wasn't standing outside this bedroom because she had suddenly discovered the truth. She was standing there because she had finally stopped explaining away everything she had already noticed. Her husband had changed. She knew that. She had known for months. But knowing something was wrong and being willing to name it were two different things. Claire had always struggled with the second. She had learned early that naming a problem made it real. And once something became real, you had to decide what to do about it. Sometimes Claire preferred uncertainty. Uncertainty allowed hope to survive. The truth demanded a decision. Another voice came from inside the bedroom. Vanessa, she really trusts you. Claire's breathing stopped. There was silence. Then Alexander said quietly, I know. Claire closed her eyes. Those 2 words broke something inside her. Not because Vanessa had said Claire trusted him. Because Alexander had admitted it. He knew. He knew she trusted him. He knew she loved him. He knew she would never imagine him capable of this, and he had used that trust as cover. Claire stepped backward. Her heel nearly touched the floor. She caught herself before making a sound. Then she turned. She walked downstairs. Slowly, carefully. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She didn't even look back. When she reached the foyer, she picked up her suitcase. Her hands were trembling now. She hated that. Claire had always prided herself on being composed. At work, people called her graceful under pressure. Her friends called her the calm one. Even Alexander had once joked that she could receive the worst news imaginable and respond by asking whether everyone had eaten. He loved that about her, or at least he used to. But perhaps there was something he had never understood. Calmness wasn't the absence of pain. Sometimes it was simply pain that had learned how to behave. Claire carried her suitcase toward the guest room. She opened the door, set the bag down, then sat on the edge of the bed. The room smelled faintly of lavender. Everything was neat, impersonal, temporary. Claire stared at the wall. Her mind refused to settle. She remembered their wedding. 11 years earlier. A small ceremony in Connecticut. Alexander had looked nervous. She had never seen him nervous before. When she walked toward him, his eyes had filled with tears. He had whispered, "You're beautiful." She had smiled. "You look terrified." "I am. Why?" "Because this is the most important thing I've ever done." Claire had believed him. That memory was cruel tonight, because the mind has a strange way of protecting itself. When something painful happens, it doesn't immediately give you the present. It gives you the past. Every beautiful moment becomes evidence. Every promise becomes a weapon. Every kiss asks whether it was real. Claire looked down at her left hand. Her wedding ring was still there. She twisted it slowly. 11 years. How could 11 years become a question in one night? She thought about all the mornings she had woken before Alexander and watched him sleep. All the vacations, the birthdays, the arguments that had been so small they were almost funny. The Christmas they spent snowed in at their Vermont house. The night Alexander had surprised her by flying her mother to New York for her birthday. The first time Claire had told him she was afraid of becoming like her mother. He had held her then. "You don't have to be afraid with me." Claire's eyes filled. She looked away, because suddenly that sentence sounded like a cruel joke. She wiped her face before the tears could fall. Then she heard footsteps. Alexander. Claire's body became completely still. The footsteps stopped outside the door. There was a pause. Then a knock. 3 quiet knocks. "Claire?" She didn't answer. Another pause. "Claire, I know you're awake." She stared at the door. Alexander tried the handle. It didn't move. "Please, open the door." Claire finally spoke. "Why?" His voice sounded different. Smaller. "I need to talk to you." "About what?" Silence. There it was again. The thing that had defined their marriage. Silence. Claire almost smiled. It was remarkable how quickly Alexander had become a stranger. A few hours ago she had been planning to surprise him. Now she was sitting behind a locked door, asking her husband what he wanted to talk about. And he still couldn't answer. "Claire," he said softly. She stood. Her bare feet touched the cold floor. She walked toward the door, but didn't open it. "Is she still upstairs?" Nothing. Claire waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then Alexander said, "She left." Claire closed her eyes. Not, there was nothing happening. "Not you misunderstood. She left." That was his answer. Claire rested her forehead against the door. "I see. I'm sorry." Her eyes opened. "Don't, Claire, and don't say you're sorry yet." "But I am." "No." Her voice remained calm. "You are sorry that I found out." Alexander went silent. The words had struck him. She could feel it, even through the door. After several seconds he said, "That's not fair." Claire almost laughed. Fair. That word. She turned away from the door. "What would be fair, Alexander?" He didn't answer. "Would it be fair if I had never come home tonight?" Silence. "Would it be fair if I had stayed in Boston until tomorrow?" Silence. "Would it be fair if I had never asked questions?" Silence. Claire nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." "Claire, please." She sat back down. "You have 10 minutes. Alexander's voice cracked slightly. 10 minutes for what? "The truth." He didn't speak. Claire waited. Then she heard the door handle move again. "Please let me in." "No." "Why?" "Because if I open that door, I'm afraid I'll start comforting you." Alexander became silent. Claire's voice softened. "And I'm the one who was betrayed." Nothing came through the door. No defense, no argument, only silence. But this time, Claire didn't hate it. Because for the first time, she wasn't using silence to avoid the truth. She was using it to make Alexander sit inside it. And perhaps that was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Not the beginning of forgiveness. Not the beginning of reconciliation. The beginning of accountability. Claire looked at the wedding ring on her finger again. Then slowly pulled it off. The skin beneath it was lighter. A small mark remained where it had rested for 11 years. She stared at that mark, then placed the ring on the nightstand. Outside the door, Alexander whispered her name. Claire didn't respond. For the first time since their wedding day, she had no intention of making his discomfort easier. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the heartbreak and disbelief, a quieter realization was beginning to form. Maybe she hadn't been too trusting. Maybe she hadn't been foolish. Maybe she had simply spent too many years believing that silence was the same thing as peace. She was about to learn that it wasn't. Because peace required truth. And tonight, truth had finally entered the Whitmore household. Whether Alexander was ready for it or not. For almost a full minute, Alexander said nothing. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the closed door. She could hear him breathing on the other side. It was strange. For 11 years, she had slept beside this man. She knew the sound of his breathing when he was asleep. She knew the way he sighed when he was frustrated. She knew how he cleared his throat before giving a presentation. She knew the quiet hum he made when he was concentrating. She knew thousands of small things about Alexander Whitmore, and yet, tonight, she had discovered that she didn't know the most important thing. Who he had become when she wasn't watching. "Claire," he finally said. She didn't answer. "I don't know where to start." She looked toward the door. "Start with the truth." Another pause. Then the handle moved. "Can I come in?" "No." The answer came quickly. Alexander went quiet. Claire wasn't being cruel. At least, she didn't think she was. She simply didn't trust herself around him yet. If she opened that door and saw his face, she knew what might happen. She might see the man she married, instead of the man who had betrayed her. She might remember the good years. She might see regret in his eyes, and mistake it for change. And perhaps most dangerously, she might begin worrying about how he felt. Claire had done that for years. She had been so good at understanding Alexander that she had sometimes forgotten to understand herself. "Tell me," she said. Alexander leaned against the wall outside. "The relationship with Vanessa started last year." Claire closed her eyes. Last year, not weeks, not a mistake, not one terrible night. A year. You knew her before that. "Yes." "How long?" "About 2 years." Claire's fingers tightened around the blanket. "Did you sleep with her the first time?" Alexander hesitated. "Yes." Claire swallowed. She had expected pain. She hadn't expected the strange calm that followed it. There was something almost merciful about a direct answer. No excuses, no carefully chosen language, just the truth. "How many times?" "Claire, how many?" "I don't know." She nodded. "Okay. I didn't keep count. I wasn't asking you to." Silence. Claire looked at the ceiling. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away immediately. "Does she love you?" Alexander didn't answer. Claire waited. "I don't know." "Do you love her?" Another pause. "I cared about her." Claire's expression hardened. "That's not what I asked." "I don't know." Claire nodded. There it was. For once, he didn't have an answer. And strangely, that hurt less than a lie would have. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, Manhattan continued moving. Cars passed beneath the streetlights. People walked along the sidewalks. Somewhere, music played from a rooftop. The world had not stopped. That seemed almost offensive. How could the city continue functioning when her entire understanding of her life had just collapsed? She looked at her reflection in the glass. 39 years old. Still wearing the wedding dress she had chosen 11 years earlier in photographs hanging downstairs. Still wearing the diamond Alexander had placed on her finger. Still the same woman. And yet she felt completely unfamiliar to herself. Why? The question came quietly. Alexander didn't respond. "Why did you do it?" "I was unhappy." Claire turned. Her voice remained surprisingly calm. "That is not an answer." "I know." "Then try again." Alexander exhaled. "I felt disconnected from you." Claire nodded slowly. "That's better." She looked back toward the window. "But it's still not enough." "I should have talked to you." "Yes." "I should have told you how I felt." "Yes." "I should have asked what you needed." "Yes." "I didn't." "No." Alexander's voice became quieter. "And instead of dealing with it, I found someone else." Claire looked at the city. "Thank you." He sounded confused. "For what?" "For finally saying it, without making me responsible." Silence. Alexander didn't understand. So Claire explained. "You could have said I wasn't affectionate enough. You could have said I was always busy. You could have said our marriage was difficult." She turned toward the door. "You could have blamed me for everything wrong between us." Her voice trembled. "But you didn't." I can't." "Why?" "Because it wouldn't be true." Claire closed her eyes. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks. "I wish you had said that a year ago." "I know. I wish you had told me you were unhappy." "I know. I wish you had given me the opportunity to fight for our marriage." "I know." Claire wiped her face. "But you made the decision for both of us." Alexander's silence confirmed it. He had. He had decided the marriage was failing. He had decided another woman was easier. He had decided Claire didn't need to know. He had decided that he could maintain 2 lives until he figured out what he wanted. He had made every decision except the one that required courage. The decision to tell the truth. Claire walked back toward the bed. "Is Vanessa still in the house?" "No." "Did she know I was coming home?" "No." "Did she know you were married?" "Yes." Claire's eyes closed again. That answer hurt differently. She had expected Vanessa to perhaps be unaware, to have been deceived. But she wasn't. Still, Claire refused to give the other woman the center of the story. Vanessa had made choices. Alexander had made choices. But Claire wasn't going to let either of them distract her from the person who had made vows to her. Her husband. Does she know you told me? I haven't spoken to her. Claire nodded. Good. Claire, I don't want to lose you. She stared at the door. Something inside her wanted to believe him. That was the dangerous part. Even after everything, part of her still loved him. Love didn't disappear simply because someone betrayed you. That was one of the cruelest things about it. You could be furious with someone and still want them to hold you. You could know they had hurt you and still remember every reason you fell in love with them. You could understand that leaving might be necessary and still wish they would give you one reason to stay. Claire sat down again. Do you know what hurts the most? Alexander's voice was quiet. What? I wasn't suspicious, because you were a terrible husband. He said nothing. You were a good husband in so many ways. Her voice cracked. That's what made it confusing. She looked down at her hands. You remembered my mother's birthday. You came to my charity events. You called when I traveled. You sent flowers. A bitter smile crossed her face. You did all these things that made me think I was loved. I did love you. Claire looked toward the door. Then you should have known that loving me and betraying me couldn't exist comfortably in the same life. Alexander didn't answer. She continued. I don't need you to tell me that Vanessa meant nothing. She didn't. That's not what I mean. Claire took a breath. I need you to understand that the affair wasn't the only betrayal. Alexander remained silent. You betrayed my ability to make decisions about my own life. That sentence finally made him respond. How? You knew the truth. Claire's voice was firm now. I didn't. You knew our marriage was in trouble. Yes. You knew you were seeing someone. Yes. You knew I was still investing my time, my trust, and my future into this marriage. Alexander's voice was barely audible. Yes. And you let me. Claire shook her head. You let me keep choosing you without giving me all the information I needed to make that choice honestly. The room went completely quiet. That was the part Alexander had never considered. He had thought the betrayal was about the affair. He hadn't understood that secrecy had taken something else from Claire. Her informed choice. She couldn't go back and decide differently. She couldn't reclaim the year she spent believing their marriage was struggling for ordinary reasons. She couldn't recover all the conversations she might have had, all the questions she might have asked, all the decisions she might have made. The truth had arrived late, and sometimes late truth could be almost as painful as the original lie. Alexander finally spoke. You're right. Claire stared at the floor. I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. Good. I don't expect you to stay. Claire's eyes lifted. That was the first thing he had said that didn't sound like an attempt to control the outcome. She nodded. Thank you. Alexander remained outside the door. Can I ask you something? Claire hesitated. What? When did you know? She almost smiled. Tonight. Before tonight, did you suspect? Claire looked toward the ceiling. Yes. Why didn't you ask me? There it was. The question she had been expecting. She could have become defensive. Instead, she answered honestly. Because I was afraid. Alexander was quiet. Of what? The answer. He didn't speak. Claire continued. I grew up watching my mother ask questions she already knew she didn't want answered. She swallowed. My father left us, and after that, my mother never really trusted anyone again. Alexander listened. I promised myself I wouldn't become bitter like her. Claire laughed softly. So instead, I became quiet. She looked at the wedding ring on the nightstand. I thought if I didn't ask the question, I wouldn't have to hear the answer. Alexander's voice was gentle. I'm sorry. Claire shook her head. Don't apologize for that. Why? Because that's mine. She paused. I have to own it. Alexander didn't respond. Claire looked at the door. You made your choices. I made mine. She took a breath. But there is something I want you to understand. I'm listening. I will never again confuse silence with peace. Alexander remained completely still. Claire continued. If something feels wrong, I will ask. She looked at the ring. If someone hurts me, I will say it. Her voice strengthened. If someone disrespects me, I will leave. A long silence followed. Then, Alexander asked, Does that mean you're leaving me? Claire looked at the closed door. I don't know. It was the most honest answer she could give, and perhaps the most frightening. Because until that moment, Alexander had believed there was still a decision to be made. Now he understood that the decision belonged to Claire, not him. He had already had his turn. Claire stood and walked toward the nightstand. She picked up the wedding ring. For a moment, she held it in her palm. Then she opened the drawer. She placed the ring inside. Not thrown away. Not destroyed. Just put away. "Where are you going to sleep?" Alexander asked. "Here." "And me?" Claire looked at the door. "Somewhere else." He nodded. She heard his footsteps move away. One step, then another, then nothing. Claire sat back down. She expected to feel victorious. She didn't. There was no victory in this, only grief. The kind of grief that arrives when you realize you're not mourning the end of something. You're mourning the person you thought you were married to. Claire lay down without changing clothes. She stared at the ceiling. At 2:14 a.m., her phone buzzed. A message from her closest friend, Maya. "Are you home?" Claire stared at it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed, "Yes," then stopped. She added, "Something happened." She stared at those words, then pressed send. For years, Claire had protected her marriage by keeping its problems private. Tonight, she realized there was a difference between privacy and isolation. Privacy could protect a relationship. Isolation could protect a lie. Her phone buzzed again. What happened? Claire looked at the message. She didn't answer immediately. Then she typed, "I came home early." 3 dots appeared. Then, and? Claire stared at the screen. Her eyes filled with tears again. She typed, "He wasn't alone." She pressed send. And for the first time that night, the truth existed outside the walls of the Whitmore mansion. Claire placed the phone beside her. She closed her eyes. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know whether her marriage would survive. She didn't know whether Alexander could ever earn her trust again. She didn't even know whether she wanted him to. But she knew one thing. Tomorrow, she would not pretend. And sometimes, that is where healing begins. Not when the pain disappears, but when you finally stop lying to yourself about how much it hurts. If you've ever stayed quiet because you were afraid of what the truth might reveal, remember this: silence can delay pain, but it cannot prevent truth. And Claire was about to discover that the truth about Alexander's affair was only one part of the story. Because before she could decide whether to leave her marriage, she first had to understand why she had spent so many years accepting emotional distance as normal. That answer began long before Alexander. It began with a little girl watching her father walk away. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. If you were Claire, and you came home early only to discover your husband with another woman, would you confront him immediately, or would you stay silent and let him explain himself first? Tell me what you would do in the comments. And be honest, because sometimes we don't know how strong we are until we're placed in a situation like this. And if Claire's story has already touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. Your support helps us continue bringing you powerful stories about love, betrayal, healing, and the choices that shape our lives. But don't go anywhere, because Claire is about to uncover something from her past that explains why she stayed silent for so long, and why this betrayal hurts much deeper than an affair. Let's continue. Before Claire Whitmore learned how to recognize betrayal, she learned how to recognize silence. She learned it in a small brick house outside Baltimore, long before she ever knew what a billionaire was, long before she wore designer dresses to charity galas, and long before she stood inside a Manhattan mansion, wondering how the man she loved could look her in the eyes every morning while hiding another woman at night. Back then, silence had a different sound. It sounded like her mother's footsteps moving through the kitchen at midnight. It sounded like the refrigerator humming while nobody spoke. It sounded like a bedroom door closing softly. And most of all, it sounded like her father's car leaving the driveway. Claire was 14 years old when she first discovered that adults could lie without saying a single word. Her father, Daniel, had always been a quiet man. He worked as an electrical contractor and spent most of his days moving from one job site to another. When Claire was younger, she thought his silence meant he was tired. Her mother, Evelyn, always said the same thing. "Your father works hard." So Claire accepted it. If her father came home late, she assumed he was working. If he ate dinner without saying much, she assumed he was exhausted. If he spent Saturday mornings staring through the kitchen window instead of talking to anyone, she assumed he had something on his mind. Children are remarkably good at believing the explanations adults give them, until the explanations stop making sense. Claire first noticed the change during the summer of her 14th year. Her father started coming home later. Then he started taking phone calls outside. He would step onto the back porch and close the door behind him. Sometimes he stayed there for 20 minutes, sometimes longer. Claire noticed because she had begun doing homework at the kitchen table. One evening, she looked through the glass door and saw her father standing beneath the porch light. He was smiling. Not the tired smile he gave her mother. A different smile, a younger smile. Claire watched him for a moment. Then he turned and saw her. His expression immediately changed. He ended the call. "What are you doing awake?" "Homework." He nodded. "Go to bed soon." Claire studied him. Who was that? Work. She accepted the answer. At least, she tried to. Months later, she would remember that moment. Not because she knew what the truth was, because she remembered how quickly he had answered. Some lies are polished. Others are automatic. And children often notice the difference before they understand it. One Friday evening, Claire woke to the sound of voices downstairs. She slipped out of bed. The hallway was dark. Her younger brother, Marcus, was asleep in the room beside hers. Claire walked quietly toward the staircase. Her parents were arguing. She couldn't hear everything, but she heard her mother's voice. "You think I don't know?" Then her father's voice. "Keep your voice down." "What am I supposed to do? Pretend?" Claire stopped. Her heart began beating faster. Her mother started crying. "I deserve the truth." Her father didn't answer. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. Claire stood halfway down the staircase. She wanted to go into the kitchen. She wanted to tell her mother she was there. She wanted someone to tell her what was happening. Instead, she remained still. Because even at 14, Claire understood something. Adults didn't always want witnesses when their lives were falling apart. The next morning, her father left early. He kissed Marcus on the forehead. He walked past Claire without looking directly at her. Her mother stood in the kitchen, holding a coffee mug with both hands. Claire watched the front door close. "Mom?" Evelyn looked at her. "What? Is Dad okay?" Her mother stared at the door. Then, she said something Claire would remember for the rest of her life. Sometimes people leave long before they actually walk out. Claire didn't understand. Not completely. "What does that mean?" Her mother forced a smile. "Nothing you need to worry about." That was another lesson. Adults often said nothing when something was everything. 3 weeks later, Daniel left. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final speech, no explanation. He simply packed a suitcase and walked out. Claire stood at the top of the stairs. Marcus was crying downstairs. Her mother wasn't. Evelyn stood beside the kitchen counter, watching her husband walk through the front door. She didn't chase him. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just watched. Then the car disappeared. And the house became quiet. That silence changed Claire. She learned that asking questions didn't necessarily bring people closer. Sometimes questions revealed things you wished you had never known. So she stopped asking. When her mother cried, Claire pretended not to notice. When Marcus asked where their father was, Claire said he was working. When relatives asked whether everything was okay, Claire smiled. "Everything is fine." It wasn't. But Claire discovered that saying fine made people stop asking questions. And that felt safe. Years later, when she entered adulthood, that habit followed her. She became the woman who said, "It's okay. It's nothing. Don't worry about it. I understand." She said those words, even when she didn't understand. Especially when she didn't. By 23, Claire had become exceptionally good at making other people comfortable. At work, she never complained. In friendships, she listened more than she spoke. In relationships, she gave people second chances. Sometimes third. She believed understanding someone meant being patient with their flaws. She didn't yet understand that there was a difference between patience and self-abandonment. Then she met Alexander. It happened at a charity event in Chicago. Claire was working with a non-profit organization that provided educational opportunities for children from low-income families. Alexander Whitmore had donated $5 million. Everyone in the room knew who he was. The billionaire businessman, the technology investor, the man whose name appeared in magazines and newspapers. Claire didn't care. She had seen wealthy people make large donations before. Sometimes, the money came with cameras. Sometimes it came with publicity. Sometimes it came with conditions. Alexander was standing near the stage when Claire approached him. "You gave $5 million. Alexander looked at her. "That's what I've been told." She smiled. "Do you know where it's going?" He paused. "Education. That's not specific enough." Alexander raised an eyebrow. Claire continued. "Which schools? Which programs? How many students?" He studied her. Most people approached him to introduce themselves. Claire had approached him to ask where his money was going. He smiled. "You're the first person tonight who has asked me that. That's because everyone else is impressed by your name. And you're not." "I'm impressed by the potential impact." Alexander laughed. It surprised her. He had a beautiful laugh. Not loud. Just genuine. "What's your name?" "Claire." "Claire what?" "Claire Bennett." He extended his hand. "Alexander Whitmore." She looked at his hand. "I know." He laughed again. And that was how it started. Not with fireworks. Not with some impossible moment. Just two people standing beneath expensive chandeliers, talking about children who would never know either of their names. After that night, Alexander found reasons to see her again. A coffee near her office, a bookstore, a museum, a quiet dinner. He never overwhelmed her. He didn't demand her attention. He seemed to understand that Claire needed space, and that made her trust him. One evening they sat in a small restaurant in Chicago. Rain tapped against the windows. Claire was reading the menu. Alexander was watching her. "What?" She looked up. "You've been staring at me. I like watching you think." Claire smiled. "That's strange. Why?" "Most people interrupt me when I'm thinking." "I don't." "Why?" Alexander leaned back. "Because I like what happens when you're quiet." Claire looked at him. That sentence touched something inside her. Nobody had ever said that before. Most people wanted Claire to talk. Alexander seemed comfortable with her silence. She mistook that comfort for understanding. And perhaps, in the beginning, it was. Their relationship grew slowly. Alexander remembered that she hated overly sweet coffee. Claire remembered that he hated being photographed while eating. He sent her books instead of flowers. She left handwritten notes inside his briefcase. They could sit together without talking for an entire afternoon. Claire felt safe. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like companionship. One Sunday morning, Alexander drove Claire outside the city. They stopped beside a quiet lake. There were no photographers, no assistants, no employees, just the two of them. They sat on the hood of his car. Claire looked at the water. "I've always been afraid of becoming like my mother." Alexander turned toward her. "Why?" She stopped trusting people. He waited. Claire rarely spoke about her father. But that morning, something made her continue. "My father left." Alexander said nothing. "My mother never recovered." Claire looked down. "I don't want to spend my life waiting for someone to leave." Alexander reached for her hand. "I won't." Claire looked at him. He didn't hesitate. "I won't leave you." Those words became one of the foundations of their relationship. Claire believed them. And when Alexander proposed 14 months later, she said yes. The wedding was beautiful, not extravagant, just elegant. Family, close friends, a garden filled with white flowers. Alexander looked nervous when Claire walked toward him. She smiled. "You're shaking." "I know. You're a billionaire. I'd rather negotiate with a room full of investors than stand here." She laughed. Then he whispered, "You're worth being nervous for." Claire believed him. For 11 years, she carried those words with her. Through every difficult season, every lonely night, every unanswered question. She carried them because they had come from the man who had once made silence feel safe. But what Claire didn't understand was that people could keep the same voice while becoming completely different people. The first few years of marriage were beautiful. They traveled. They built a home. They hosted dinners. Claire became involved in charitable organizations. Alexander's company expanded. His wealth grew. Their lives became increasingly luxurious. But the more Alexander's world expanded, the smaller their private world became. It happened gradually. So gradually that Claire couldn't identify the exact moment. Dinner became shorter. Conversations became practical. He started checking his phone during meals, then during movies, then during conversations. At first, Claire said nothing. She told herself he was busy. Then he started traveling more. She said nothing. She told herself success came with responsibilities. Then he stopped asking about her day. She noticed, but she said nothing. She told herself he was tired. And slowly, without either of them realizing it, their marriage became a place where silence was no longer comforting. It was simply easier. One night, Claire sat across from Alexander at dinner. He was reading something on his phone. She waited. Finally, she said, "Do you remember when we used to talk for hours?" Alexander looked up. "Of course. I miss that." He smiled. "I'm just busy right now." "I know. We'll have more time soon." Claire nodded. "Okay." She returned to her dinner. That one word, "okay," was the beginning of something neither of them recognized. Because Claire didn't really mean okay, and Alexander didn't ask. That was how their marriage slowly learned to lie. Not through dramatic arguments, not through cruelty, through little sentences that meant something different from what they said. Okay meant "I'm hurt." "I'm tired" meant "I don't want to talk." "Maybe later" meant "not now." "I'm fine" meant "please notice that I'm not." And eventually, the words became so familiar that neither of them heard what was underneath them. Claire would later understand that emotional distance rarely arrives with a warning. It often arrives disguised as routine. A missed dinner, a postponed conversation, A phone placed face down. A hug that becomes a kiss on the forehead. A question you decide not to ask. Then another, until one day you look across the room at the person you married and realize you have become strangers who know each other's schedules. That was what happened to Claire. She didn't lose Alexander in one night. She lost pieces of him slowly. And worse, she lost pieces of herself while pretending she hadn't noticed. Because Claire had learned as a 14-year-old girl that silence could keep a family from breaking apart. She hadn't yet learned that sometimes silence doesn't save a relationship. Sometimes it simply gives the cracks enough time to spread. And while Claire was learning to live with the growing distance in her marriage, Alexander was beginning to spend more and more time with a woman named Vanessa Reed. A woman Claire had already met. A woman Claire had once welcomed into her home. A woman who would eventually become the reason Claire stopped believing that patience was always a virtue. But before Vanessa entered their marriage, there had been warning signs. And Claire had seen almost every one of them. She simply hadn't trusted herself enough to call them what they were. The first warning sign wasn't Vanessa. It was Alexander's phone. Claire remembered the evening because it had been so ordinary. A Tuesday in October, rain had been tapping softly against the windows of the townhouse, and Claire had spent most of the afternoon preparing a presentation for a literacy foundation she supported. Alexander was supposed to be home by 7. At 7:18, he texted, "Running late. Don't wait for me." Claire stared at the message. She typed, "Okay," then deleted it. She typed, "Everything okay?" Deleted that too. Finally she sent, "Okay." She placed the phone face down. Then she laughed quietly at herself. Why had she almost asked whether everything was okay? Nothing had happened. Alexander was busy. That was all. At 9:47, he came through the door. Claire was still awake. "You haven't eaten?" he asked. "I'm not hungry." He loosened his tie. "Sorry." "It's fine." He kissed her forehead, then walked upstairs. Claire watched him disappear. She wanted to ask where he had been. She wanted to ask why he smelled faintly of a perfume she didn't recognize. Instead, she cleaned the kitchen. That night, she lay beside him while he slept. She stared at the ceiling. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't explain what. And because she couldn't explain it, she convinced herself she had no right to bring it up. That was Claire's mistake. She believed you needed proof before you were allowed to express discomfort. She didn't understand that feelings weren't courtroom evidence. You didn't need a photograph to say, "Something has changed." You didn't need a confession to say, "I don't feel close to you anymore." You didn't need proof of betrayal to ask for honesty. But Claire didn't know that yet. So she stayed quiet. The changes continued. Alexander began keeping his phone with him constantly. He used to leave it on the kitchen counter. Now it followed him from room to room. He used to answer calls around Claire. Now, he stepped outside. He used to tell her about business problems. Now he said, "Nothing you need to worry about." Claire noticed. She said nothing. Then came the business trips. There had always been business trips. Alexander ran an international company. Travel was part of his life. But suddenly, there were more. Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, London, then Chicago again. Claire began noticing that some trips appeared on his calendar only after they had already happened. One Friday morning, she looked at his schedule. He was supposed to be in Chicago for 3 days. Yet there was no flight confirmation in the shared travel folder. She stared at the screen, then closed it. She could ask, but she didn't. That evening, Alexander walked into the kitchen. "How was your day?" "Good." "What did you do?" "Foundation meeting." He nodded. "How did it go?" "Well." Silence. Claire looked at him. "How was Chicago?" Alexander paused. "Good." "What did you guys work on?" "Nothing major." She waited. He didn't elaborate. "Okay." He smiled, then kissed her forehead. Claire watched him walk away. That night, she opened the bedroom drawer. There was a photograph of them from their honeymoon. She picked it up. They were standing on a beach in Hawaii. Alexander's arm was around her. Claire was laughing. They looked happy. She wondered when happiness had stopped looking effortless. She wondered whether she was imagining the distance. Perhaps this was simply what happened after 11 years. Perhaps marriage wasn't supposed to feel exciting forever. Perhaps adulthood meant accepting that romance became quieter. She had heard people say that. Love changes. People change. Marriage changes. Maybe she simply needed to adjust. So she did. She adjusted. She asked fewer questions. She expected less. She stopped planning surprise dates because Alexander was always busy. She stopped waiting for him to come home before eating. She stopped telling him about every little thing that happened during her day. And each time she withdrew a little, Alexander withdrew too. Neither noticed that they were creating the very distance they feared. Then Vanessa appeared more frequently. At first, she was just a name. Vanessa sent the numbers. Vanessa is handling Chicago. Vanessa thinks we should reconsider the acquisition. Claire didn't care. She trusted Alexander. One afternoon, she was hosting a small charity luncheon at their home. Alexander was supposed to join them. Vanessa arrived with him. Claire smiled. Vanessa? Claire? Vanessa looked around the room. This place is beautiful. Thank you. Alexander placed a hand lightly against Claire's back. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then Claire noticed something. Vanessa wasn't looking at the house. She was looking at Alexander. It lasted only a second. But Claire saw it. A familiarity, a warmth, something that made Claire's stomach tighten. She dismissed it immediately. Maybe she was simply tired. Maybe she was becoming suspicious because Alexander had been distant. She refused to become the kind of wife who accused her husband every time another woman smiled at him. So she smiled. Would you like some wine? Vanessa smiled. Sure. The luncheon continued. Nothing happened. Nothing obvious. But after everyone left, Claire found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at 2 wine glasses. One belonged to Vanessa. The other belonged to Alexander. She picked them up, then stopped. She almost laughed. What was she doing? She was turning a wine glass into evidence. She put them in the dishwasher and said to herself, "You're being ridiculous." But that night, Alexander slept facing away from her. Claire remained awake. She stared at his back. A strange thought entered her mind. When did I become afraid to ask my own husband simple questions? She didn't like the answer. The answer was, because you're afraid of what he'll say. That thought stayed with her. Weeks later, Claire found a message. It appeared on Alexander's phone while he was in the shower. She hadn't intended to look. She was searching for a photograph of her mother that Alexander had taken during Thanksgiving. His phone lit up. A message appeared. Vanessa, last night was wonderful. I wish we had more time. Claire froze. She didn't touch the phone. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Her heart had already understood. She stepped away. A minute later, Alexander came out of the bathroom. He saw her standing near the desk. Everything okay? Claire looked at him. She could have asked. She almost did. Instead, she said, "Your phone lit up." Alexander looked at the phone. His face changed. Only slightly. But Claire saw it. "Who is it?" He picked up the phone. "Work." Claire stared at him. "At 10:30 at night?" "It's nothing." There it was. Nothing. The word that had become the wall between them. Claire nodded. "Okay." Alexander looked at her. For a moment, she thought he might tell her. He didn't. He walked away. Claire remained standing there. She felt something inside her crack. Not loudly. Quietly. The way ice cracks beneath someone's feet. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about opening his phone. She didn't. She thought about calling Vanessa. She didn't. She thought about confronting Alexander. She didn't. Instead, she went downstairs and made tea. That was how Claire dealt with pain. She made tea. She cleaned. She organized. She worked. She helped other people. She did everything except face the thing hurting her. But that night, something changed. She began keeping a private journal. Not because she wanted to spy on Alexander. Because she needed to know whether she was imagining things. She wrote down dates, trips, unexplained absences, messages, changes in behavior. Not accusations. Just facts. And the more she wrote, the clearer the pattern became. She wasn't imagining it. Something was happening. One evening, she confronted Alexander indirectly. "Do you still love me?" He looked up from his laptop. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one." "Of course I do." Claire waited. "Do you?" Alexander frowned. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I don't feel loved." He closed the laptop. "Claire, I'm under a lot of pressure." "I know. My company is expanding." "I know. There's a lot happening." "I know." He reached for her hand. "Nothing has changed." Claire looked at their hands. That was the lie. Something had changed. Everything had changed. But she couldn't prove what. So she withdrew her hand, gently. "I hope you're right." Alexander looked at her. "Why wouldn't I be?" Claire smiled sadly. "Because sometimes people are the last ones to know when their own marriage is ending." Alexander's expression hardened. "Our marriage isn't ending." She nodded. "Okay." He returned to his laptop. Claire walked away. She went upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and cried silently. Not because she knew about Vanessa. Not completely. She cried because some part of her had finally accepted that she might be standing alone inside a marriage built for two. And that realization frightened her more than the possibility of infidelity. Because if Alexander had cheated, there was a clear betrayal. But if he simply no longer loved her, what could she fight? You cannot negotiate someone's feelings. You cannot reason someone into wanting you. You cannot work harder until another person chooses you again. Claire understood that. But she still hoped. Hope can be beautiful. It can also keep people in places they have already outgrown. Then came the trip to Boston. Claire was scheduled to attend a 3-day conference for the foundation. Alexander kissed her goodbye at the airport. "Call me when you land." "I will. I love you." Claire looked into his eyes. For a second, she wanted to ask, "Do you really?" But she didn't. "I love you too." She boarded the plane. During the first day of the conference, Alexander texted normally. The second day, less. On the third morning, he sent, "Hope everything is going well. I'll see you tomorrow." Claire stared at the message. She smiled. Then something unexpected happened. The conference ended early. Her return flight was scheduled for the following afternoon. She could have stayed. She could have spent the night in Boston. She could have gone to dinner with the other women from the conference. Instead, she changed her flight. She wanted to go home. Maybe she missed Alexander. Maybe she missed her house. Maybe she simply wanted to feel normal again. She didn't tell him. She wanted to surprise him. At the airport, she bought a small box of chocolates from a shop she knew he liked. She smiled while carrying them through the terminal. For the first time in months, she felt excited about seeing her husband. She imagined his reaction. She imagined him opening the door. She imagined his face. She had no idea that the surprise she thought would bring them closer would finally expose the distance between them. Her flight landed just after 10. By 11:43, Claire was standing inside the dark foyer of her home. And by midnight, she was standing outside her bedroom door. Listening. The woman inside was Vanessa. The man was Alexander. And the truth Claire had spent months refusing to name finally had a face. Claire didn't scream. She didn't fight. She didn't even knock. She simply walked away. Because sometimes the moment you finally see the truth is not the moment you become angry. Sometimes it is the moment you become tired. Tired of wondering. Tired of explaining. Tired of pretending. And Claire was tired. But the next morning, she would have to decide what came after the truth. Because knowing someone betrayed you is one thing. Deciding what to do with that knowledge is another. And Claire was about to learn that protecting your dignity doesn't always mean walking away immediately. Sometimes it means staying long enough to hear the truth. Not for them, for yourself. The morning after Claire discovered the affair, the Whitmore mansion looked exactly the same. That was what disturbed her most. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight. The flowers on the dining table were still fresh. The coffee machine still hummed in the kitchen. Outside, Manhattan was already awake. Cars moved through the streets. People hurried toward offices. Delivery trucks stopped at buildings. Somewhere, someone was probably celebrating a promotion. Someone else was probably falling in love. Someone was probably having the best morning of their life. And inside the Whitmore home, Claire sat alone at the breakfast table, wondering how a life could look so normal after something inside it had completely broken. She hadn't slept, not really. She had closed her eyes for an hour or two, but every time she drifted off, she heard Vanessa's voice again. "Are you sure she won't come home?" And then Alexander's answer, "No, she won't be back until tomorrow." That sentence kept returning. Not the affair, not the bedroom, not even the woman. That sentence, because it revealed something Claire couldn't ignore. Alexander had built his plans around her absence. He had expected her to be somewhere else. He had expected her trust to give him room. Claire looked at the cup of coffee in front of her. It had gone cold. She hadn't noticed. At 7:06, she heard footsteps. Alexander entered the kitchen. He was dressed in a dark suit. His tie was perfectly straight. His hair was neatly styled. He looked like the man who appeared on magazine covers. The billionaire. The businessman. The husband who had everything under control, except his own life. He stopped when he saw Claire. She looked up. Neither spoke. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Alexander pulled out the chair across from her. "Can I sit?" Claire nodded. He sat. The silence returned. But it wasn't the comfortable silence they had once shared. This silence had weight. It carried everything they weren't saying. Alexander looked at the untouched coffee. "You haven't slept." "Neither have you." "I slept for a little while." "So did I." Another pause. He looked at her hands. Her wedding ring was gone. His eyes stayed there for a moment. "Claire," she looked at him. "I know. You don't have to say anything." "I know." He lowered his eyes. "I want to explain." Claire took a breath. "I know. Can I?" She thought about it, then nodded. "Yes." Alexander leaned back. "I don't know how to make this sound less terrible." "You can't." He nodded. "I know." He looked down at his hands. I've been unhappy for a long time. Claire's expression didn't change. You told me last night. I know. And you still haven't told me why. Alexander was quiet. I felt like we stopped being connected. Claire stared at him. Do you know when that happened? No. I do. He looked up. Do you? Yes. When? Claire thought about it. The first time I asked you how you were feeling, and you told me you were tired. Alexander frowned. That was years ago. Exactly. He didn't respond. Claire continued. You were tired, then you were busy, then you had meetings, then you had travel, then there was always something. She folded her hands together. I kept believing the next week would be different. Alexander looked away. And it wasn't. No. Claire's voice remained steady. But you didn't tell me. I should have. Yes. I didn't know how. Claire almost smiled. You knew how to tell me everything else. He looked at her. What do you mean? You told me when your company was struggling. She paused. You told me when you were worried about losing an acquisition. You told me when your father was sick. You told me when you were angry at your board. She looked directly into his eyes. You told me when the stock market dropped and cost you millions in one afternoon. Alexander said nothing. But when it came to us, you suddenly didn't know how to speak. His jaw tightened. Claire noticed. She had seen that expression before. He was uncomfortable. Usually she would soften the conversation when he became uncomfortable. Not this time. You knew how to talk about everything except your marriage. Alexander exhaled. I was afraid. Of what? That you wouldn't understand. Claire looked at him for several seconds. I was your wife. I know. You didn't have to know whether I would understand. She paused. You only had to trust me enough to ask. Alexander looked down. The words were simple, but they carried 11 years behind them. Then Claire asked the question she had been avoiding. Was she the reason? Alexander looked at her. Vanessa? Yes. No. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. Then why her? Alexander hesitated. Because she was there. Claire stared at him. The answer was so simple that it almost made her angry. That's your explanation? No. Then what is? Alexander rubbed his forehead. With her, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself. Claire felt something inside her tighten. You didn't have to explain yourself because you weren't married to her. Alexander looked at her. Claire continued. She didn't know your history. She didn't know your fears. She didn't know your family. She didn't know the parts of you that required work. Claire's voice softened. Of course it was easier. Alexander didn't answer. Claire looked toward the window. Easy isn't the same thing as meaningful. I know. Do you? Yes. When did you learn? Last night. Claire shook her head. No. She looked at him. You learned last night that I found out. Alexander didn't argue. That silence was different. He knew she was right. Claire stood. She carried her coffee to the sink. Then she returned to the table. I need to know something. Anything. How long? Alexander knew what she meant. About 11 months. Claire's face remained still. 11 months. Almost a year. She sat down again. 11 months. Yes. During our anniversary? Alexander closed his eyes. During my mother's surgery? He didn't answer immediately. Claire's voice became quieter. Alexander. Yes. She looked away. That hurt. Not because of the affair itself. Because 11 months meant memories. It meant dates. It meant moments she had believed were real. It meant there were probably hundreds of conversations where Alexander had been carrying a secret, while Claire had been carrying ordinary life. She looked at him. Did you think about leaving me? Alexander was quiet. Sometimes. Claire nodded. Did you ever tell me? No. Why? I didn't want to hurt you. She gave a small, humorless laugh. You were afraid of hurting me, so you had an affair. Alexander's face tightened. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you wanted to avoid one difficult conversation and created a much bigger problem. He nodded. That's exactly what I did. Claire leaned back. For the first time she saw something in his face she hadn't seen in months. Shame. Not embarrassment. Not fear of losing his reputation. Shame. She didn't know whether that made things better. It didn't make them worse. It simply made the truth more visible. Alexander reached across the table. Claire moved her hand away. He stopped. Sorry? She nodded. I need space. I'll give you space. I mean, real space. I understand. I don't want you sleeping in our bedroom. I won't. I don't want you bringing her here again. She won't be coming here. I don't want you calling me every hour. I won't. Claire took a breath. And I don't want you telling me you love me every 5 minutes because you're afraid I'm going to leave. Alexander stared at her. Okay. She nodded. Thank you. He stood. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. He walked toward the door, then stopped. Claire, she looked up. I know I don't deserve to ask you this. What? Please don't make any decisions today. She stared at him. I won't. He nodded, then left. Claire listened to his footsteps disappear. For the first time since she had come home, she was alone. Completely alone. She looked at the empty chair across from her. There had been a time when she couldn't imagine eating breakfast without Alexander. Now she couldn't imagine eating it with him. That realization frightened her, not because she wanted him, because she realized she was beginning to understand that she could live without him. And once a person discovers they can survive without something they once believed they couldn't live without, the balance changes. Claire went upstairs. She opened the closet. Her suitcase was still packed. She looked at the clothes inside. Then she closed it. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. She needed to understand what had happened. But more importantly, she needed to understand what had happened to her. Because somewhere along the way, she had become a woman who noticed pain and apologized for feeling it. She had become someone who questioned her own instincts. She had become someone who believed keeping the peace was more important than speaking honestly. And that wasn't Alexander's fault. Not entirely. He was responsible for his betrayal. But Claire was responsible for learning why she had stayed silent. That afternoon, she called Maya. Her closest friend answered immediately. Claire? Hi. Maya was quiet. Then, how are you? Claire almost said fine. The word reached the back of her throat. She stopped it. I'm not okay. There was silence on the other end. Not uncomfortable silence. Safe silence. Maya didn't rush to fill it. Claire closed her eyes. I think that's the first time I've said that out loud. You don't have to be okay. I know. Do you want me to come over? Claire hesitated, then said, yes. Maya arrived 40 minutes later. She didn't ask for details immediately. She walked into the kitchen, put her bag down, and hugged Claire. Claire broke, not loudly. She simply leaned into her friend and cried. Maya held her. After several minutes, Claire whispered, I feel stupid. Maya pulled back. Don't. I should have known. You knew something was wrong. I should have done more. No. I kept making excuses. That doesn't make his decision your fault. Claire wiped her face. Maya looked at her carefully. You know what I think? What? You've spent so much time trying to understand why other people hurt you that you've forgotten to ask whether you were hurting yourself by staying quiet. Claire looked down. That sentence stayed with her. Because it was true. Maya sat beside her. You don't have to decide today whether you stay or leave. I know. You don't even have to decide whether you forgive him. I know. But you do need to decide one thing. What? Whether you're going to start telling yourself the truth. Claire looked at her. Maya continued. Whatever happens with Alexander, don't abandon yourself to save the marriage. Claire's eyes filled again. That was the lesson she had never learned. She had spent years trying to preserve the relationship. She had forgotten that a relationship was supposed to preserve something too. Her sense of safety, her dignity, her voice. That evening, Alexander came home earlier than usual. Claire was sitting in the library. He stopped at the doorway. I won't bother you. Claire looked up. You can come in. He entered. He sat across from her. For several minutes, they said nothing. Then Claire asked, Are you still seeing her? No. Are you sure? Yes. How do you know? I ended it. Claire nodded. Did she fight you? She asked me to reconsider. And? I didn't. Why? Alexander looked at her. Because I finally understood what I was doing. Claire studied him. What were you doing? Hiding. From what? From myself. She didn't respond. Alexander looked around the library. This house is full of things we bought because we thought they would make us happy. Claire glanced around. I know, but none of it helped. No. I thought if I worked harder, everything would eventually feel right. Claire smiled faintly. That's what people like you do. What do you mean? You solve problems. Alexander nodded. And I thought our marriage was a problem I could ignore until it solved itself. Claire looked at him. It didn't. No. He lowered his eyes. I made it worse. Claire didn't comfort him. She didn't tell him it would be okay. She didn't tell him they would figure it out. She simply said, yes. And somehow, that single word was more honest than anything they had said to each other in years. The conversation ended there. But something had changed. Not because the marriage was fixed. It wasn't. Not because Claire had forgiven him. She hadn't. Something changed because, for once, neither of them pretended. That night, Claire returned to the guest room. Alexander slept in another part of the house, and for the first time in 11 years, they went to bed knowing exactly where they stood. It was painful, but it was honest, and sometimes honesty hurts more at first, because it removes the comfort of illusion. Yet once the illusion is gone, something unexpected can begin. Clarity. Claire didn't know it yet, but clarity would become the beginning of her healing. And before she could decide what to do with Alexander, she would have to confront the deeper question she had avoided since childhood. Why had she spent so much of her life believing that staying quiet was the same thing as being strong? The question followed Claire into the night. Why had she spent so much of her life believing that staying quiet was the same thing as being strong? She lay awake in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but for once, the silence wasn't coming from Alexander. It was coming from inside her. Claire thought about her mother, about the kitchen table, about her father's footsteps, about the years of pretending everything was fine. Then she thought about Alexander, and suddenly, the connection became impossible to ignore. Her mother had stayed quiet to survive her marriage. Claire had stayed quiet to preserve hers. Different circumstances, different people, the same pattern. She had spent her childhood watching a woman swallow pain. Then she had grown into a woman who did the same thing. The realization made her sit upright. Maybe she had spent 11 years trying so hard not to become her mother that she had unknowingly inherited the very behavior she feared. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't cold. But she had learned to endure. And endurance, when used incorrectly, could become a prison. The next morning, Claire called her mother. Evelyn answered on the fourth ring. "Claire?" "Hi, Mom." There was something in Claire's voice. Evelyn noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" Claire looked out the window. "I need to ask you something." "Okay. Why didn't you leave Dad sooner?" Silence. Claire closed her eyes. There it was. The question she had been carrying for 25 years. Her mother didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "Because I was afraid." Claire swallowed. "Of what?" "Everything." "Being alone?" "Yes." "Money?" "Yes." "People judging you?" "Yes." Evelyn paused. "But mostly, I was afraid that if I admitted the marriage was broken, I would have to admit I had made the wrong choice." Claire sat down. Her mother's words landed heavily. "I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, your father might come back." "Did he?" "No." Claire looked down. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were a child. I knew something was wrong." "I know. I thought you didn't trust me." Evelyn's voice cracked. "It wasn't that." "Then what?" "I was ashamed." Claire closed her eyes. That word, shame. It had been hiding beneath so many things. Her mother's silence. Her father's departure. Claire's own fear. "You shouldn't have been ashamed." "I know that now." "Do you?" "Yes." Evelyn breathed deeply. "Claire, listen to me." "I'm listening." "Don't spend your life trying to prove you can survive something." Claire's eyes filled. "What do you mean?" "There's a difference between being strong enough to stay and being strong enough to leave." Claire didn't speak. Her mother continued. "And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is admit that something is hurting you." Claire wiped a tear from her cheek. "Mom?" "Yes?" "I think I've been doing the same thing." "I know." Claire looked up. "You knew?" "I'm your mother." A faint smile appeared on Claire's face. "I don't know what I'm going to do." "You don't have to know today." "Everyone keeps telling me that." "Because it's true." Evelyn paused. "Just don't make your next decision because you're afraid." Claire nodded, even though her mother couldn't see it. "Okay. Are you sure?" Claire smiled faintly. "Yeah." For the first time, she meant it. After the call ended, Claire sat quietly for several minutes. Then she opened her journal. She wrote, "I don't have to decide today." Underneath it, she wrote, "But I do have to stop abandoning myself." She stared at the sentence, then underlined it. That afternoon, Claire returned to the foundation office. She had taken 2 days away from work after the discovery. She almost cancelled again. But she knew staying home would give her mind too much room to spiral. The foundation's director, Helen, met her at the entrance. Helen was a woman in her 60s who had known Claire for years. She hugged her. "You don't have to explain anything." Claire smiled. "Thank you. Do you want coffee?" "Yes." "Black?" "Please." They walked toward the office. Helen handed her the cup. Claire took a sip. "How much work did I miss?" "Enough to keep you distracted." Claire laughed softly. "Good. Helen looked at her. You know, Claire, you don't always have to be the strong one. Claire smiled. Apparently everyone knows that except me. Helen squeezed her arm. Then perhaps it's time you learned. That sentence stayed with her. The day passed quickly. Meetings, emails, budgets, calls, children's education programs. For several hours, Claire forgot about Alexander. Then her phone buzzed. A message from him. I won't come home until late. I want to give you space. Claire stared at the screen. She typed, thank you. Then she stopped. She almost added, are you okay? She deleted the thought. Not every uncomfortable feeling required her immediate attention. That was new. She was beginning to understand that boundaries weren't punishments. They were instructions for how she needed to be treated. That evening, Claire stopped at a small bookstore before going home. She wandered through the aisles. She had always loved bookstores. They reminded her that there were countless lives outside her own. She picked up a book about emotional boundaries. She almost laughed. Of all the books. But she bought it. At home, she made dinner for herself. Not for Alexander. Not because he wasn't allowed to eat. Because she was hungry. That small distinction felt strangely powerful. For years, she had organized her evenings around his schedule. Now she was beginning to organize her life around herself. At 9:30, Alexander returned. He didn't come looking for her. He went upstairs. Claire heard his footsteps. Then, silence. She opened her book. For the first time since discovering the affair, she felt something close to peace. Not happiness. Not forgiveness. Peace. It lasted until her phone rang. An unknown number. Claire stared at the screen. She answered, hello? A woman's voice. Claire? Claire's stomach tightened. Yes? This is Vanessa. Claire became completely still. For a moment, she considered hanging up. Instead, she said, why are you calling me? I wanted to apologize. Claire looked toward the window. Why? I don't expect you to forgive me. Good. Vanessa went quiet. Claire waited. I knew about you. I know. I knew you were married. I know. I should have walked away. Claire's jaw tightened. Yes. I'm not calling to defend myself. Then why? Vanessa exhaled. Because I think you deserve to know something. Claire's fingers tightened around the phone. What? Alexander told me he was going to leave you. Claire closed her eyes. There it was. Another piece of the story. When? Months ago. Claire didn't speak. He told me the marriage was basically over. Claire felt the room tilt slightly. She sat down. Did you believe him? Yes. Why? Because he told me you were emotionally disconnected. Claire laughed softly. It wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. So, he told you the same story he was telling himself. Vanessa didn't answer. Claire continued. He made you believe he was trapped. I know. No. Claire's voice hardened. You don't. There was silence. You don't know what it means to be married to someone for 11 years and discover that while you were trying to save the relationship, he was explaining to someone else why it wasn't worth saving. Vanessa sounded emotional. I'm sorry. Claire closed her eyes. I don't need your apology. Then what do you need? The truth. Vanessa went quiet. Was he planning to leave me? I don't know. Did he tell you he loved you? A long pause. Yes. Claire's heart sank. But she didn't react. Did you love him? Yes. Claire nodded. Thank you for telling me. Claire, I'm going to hang up now. I understand. Claire ended the call. She sat completely still. The betrayal had just become more complicated. Alexander hadn't simply fallen into an affair. He had constructed a story. A story where his marriage was already dead. A story where he was the victim of circumstances. A story where leaving Claire was inevitable. And Vanessa had believed it. Claire didn't know whether to be angry or sad. Then she realized something. It didn't matter. Vanessa's version couldn't change what Alexander had done. Claire went upstairs. Alexander was in his study. He looked up when she entered. Everything okay? No. He closed his laptop. What happened? Vanessa called me. Alexander's face changed immediately. Why? She apologized. He stood. What did she say? Claire stared at him. She said you told her you were going to leave me. Alexander didn't answer. Did you? I thought about it. Did you tell her you would? I told her I wasn't sure our marriage could continue. Claire nodded. When? Months ago. How many? I don't remember. Of course. Alexander looked at her. Claire, I wasn't trying to manipulate her. Maybe not. She paused. But you were trying to convince yourself. He lowered his eyes. I was confused. I know. Things between us had been bad. Yes. But I didn't know what to do. You knew what to do. He looked at her. You could have come to me. I should have. Claire's voice softened. Yes. He nodded. I should have. She took a breath. Do you know what I find interesting? What? You told Vanessa that our marriage was over. Alexander didn't speak. But you never told me. He closed his eyes. Claire continued. You gave another woman a version of our future before you gave your wife the truth about the present. That sentence broke through him. He sat down. Claire watched him. For a moment, she saw the man she had married. Not the billionaire, not the businessman, just Alexander, a frightened man who had made terrible choices. And that was the hardest part. It would have been easier if he were simply cruel. But people were rarely that simple. A person could be wounded and still cause wounds. A person could love you and still betray you. A person could regret what they did and still have to live with the consequences. Understanding that didn't erase responsibility. It simply made the truth more complicated. Alexander looked up. I don't know how to fix this. Claire shook her head. Maybe you can't. He looked wounded. Then what am I supposed to do? Stop trying to fix it. He stared at her. Then what? Understand it. She pointed gently toward his chest. Understand why you did what you did. Then toward herself. And understand what it did to me. Alexander nodded slowly. Claire walked toward the door. Where are you going? To bed. Claire. She stopped. I still love you. Claire looked back. I know. I mean it. I know. Doesn't that matter? Claire's eyes softened. Yes. Alexander waited. But love isn't the only thing that matters. He said nothing. Claire opened the door. Trust matters. She stepped into the hallway. Honesty matters. Another step. Respect matters. She paused. And sometimes loving someone means accepting that you don't get to decide whether they stay. She walked away. Alexander remained in his study, alone. For the first time in his adult life, money couldn't solve the problem in front of him. His lawyers couldn't solve it. His assistants couldn't solve it. His influence couldn't solve it. There was no negotiation, no acquisition, no strategy. There was only a woman he had hurt and a trust he had destroyed. And Claire was beginning to understand something equally important. She didn't have to become hard because someone had hurt her. She didn't have to hate Alexander to leave him. She didn't have to forgive him before she was ready. She didn't even have to decide whether the marriage would survive. She simply had to stop lying to herself. That night, she wrote one final sentence in her journal. I cannot control what he chose. I can control what I choose next. Then she closed the book. Outside the bedroom window, Manhattan glittered beneath the night sky. Claire watched the lights for a long time. She had spent years believing that strength meant enduring whatever life placed in front of her. Now she was learning something different. Sometimes strength was asking the uncomfortable question. Sometimes strength was saying no. Sometimes strength was walking away. And sometimes strength was staying long enough to see whether someone was capable of becoming honest. Claire wasn't ready to decide which one she would choose. But she knew she would never again make that decision from fear. And that was the first real change in her. Not that she stopped loving Alexander, not that she stopped hurting, but that, for the first time, she started choosing herself. 3 weeks passed after Claire came home early. 3 weeks since the sound of Vanessa's voice had turned her marriage into a question. 3 weeks since Claire had removed her wedding ring. And, strangely, the world had not stopped. The sun still rose over Manhattan every morning. The stock market still opened. Alexander's company still made millions of dollars. Claire's foundation still held meetings. People still called her by her married name, Mrs. Whitmore, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Claire no longer slept in the master bedroom. Alexander had moved into one of the guest suites on the opposite side of the house. They passed one another occasionally in the hallways. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. The strange thing was that their house had become quieter than ever. Yet Claire no longer feared the silence. She had begun to understand it. There was a difference between silence that hid something and silence that gave you room to think. She was learning to use the second kind. Every morning, she woke at 6. She walked for 40 minutes. Then she came home, made coffee, and read before going to work. She had started therapy twice a week. She didn't tell Alexander about every session. She didn't need to. For the first time in her life, Claire was learning that not every part of her emotional life needed to be explained to someone else, especially not to the person who had hurt her. But healing was not linear. Some mornings, she felt strong. Other mornings, she woke up reaching toward the empty side of the bed before remembering why it was empty. One Saturday morning, she found herself standing in the kitchen holding 2 coffee cups. She had automatically made Alexander's coffee. She stared at it, then laughed quietly. Old habits had survived the betrayal. She poured the second cup into the sink. Alexander walked in. He stopped. "You made coffee?" "I did." "For me?" Claire looked at the empty sink. "I made too much." He smiled faintly. "I'll make my own." "Okay." He reached for the coffee machine. Neither spoke. Claire watched him. There was something different about Alexander too. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't constantly checking her mood. He wasn't trying to buy his way back into her life. He had stopped sending flowers, stopped sending gifts, stopped asking whether she had made a decision. Instead, he was simply giving her space. It didn't erase what he had done. But Claire noticed. People often talked about change as if it were dramatic. A speech, a grand gesture, a public apology. But real change was usually much quieter. It looked like respecting a boundary you didn't like. It looked like accepting consequences without complaining. It looked like doing the right thing when nobody was watching. Claire was beginning to notice those things, but she wasn't ready to trust them. Not yet. That afternoon, Alexander had a meeting with his attorney. Claire wasn't supposed to hear the conversation, but as she walked past his office, she heard his voice. "I don't want her pressured." Claire stopped. His attorney said something she couldn't hear. Alexander responded, "No." Another pause. "I don't care what it costs." Claire frowned. She continued walking. Later that evening, Alexander found her in the library. "Can we talk?" Claire closed her book. "Sure." He sat across from her. "My attorney is preparing separation documents." Claire's expression remained calm. "Okay. I wanted you to know before you received anything." She nodded. "Thank you." "I haven't filed anything." Claire looked at him. "Why not?" "Because you haven't decided what you want." She studied him. "You're willing to wait?" "Yes." "How long?" "As long as you need." Claire leaned back. "You used to hate waiting." "I know. What changed?" Alexander looked down. "You did." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "I realized I had spent years expecting you to adjust to me." He looked at her. "Your schedule, my work, my moods." He paused. "I always assumed you would accommodate me." Claire said nothing. "And now I'm realizing that I don't get to ask you to accommodate something I broke." That answer surprised her. She didn't expect it. She looked down at her book. "Thank you." Alexander nodded, then stood. He walked toward the door. "Alexander?" He turned. "Are you still in love with Vanessa?" He didn't hesitate. "No." Claire nodded. "Okay." He left. Claire remained in the library. She didn't know why she had asked. Maybe she needed to hear the answer. Maybe she wanted to test whether his response would change. It didn't. That mattered. But not enough. Not yet. The following week, Claire attended a charity gala. She almost didn't go. Maya convinced her. "You can't disappear because your husband cheated." Claire laughed. "I'm not disappearing. You're hiding." "There's a difference." "Not always." Claire eventually agreed. She wore a black evening gown. Simple. Elegant. No attempt to impress anyone. When she entered the ballroom, conversations quieted slightly. People knew. Not officially, but rumors traveled quickly in wealthy circles. The Whitmore marriage was unstable. Some said Alexander had been unfaithful. Others said Claire had left him. Nobody knew the truth. Claire didn't care. She greeted the foundation's donors. She spoke with board members. She smiled. Then she saw Vanessa. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood alone near the bar. Claire froze for half a second. Vanessa looked at her. Their eyes met. Vanessa immediately looked away. Claire could have walked in the opposite direction. Instead, she walked toward her. Vanessa noticed. "Claire." "Hello? Can we talk?" Claire nodded. They moved toward a quiet corner. Vanessa looked nervous. "I didn't expect you to speak to me." "Neither did I." Vanessa gave a small smile. "I'm sorry." Claire studied her. "I know. I mean it." "I know." Vanessa swallowed. "I don't expect forgiveness." "You shouldn't." Vanessa nodded. Claire looked around the room. "Why are you here?" "Work." "Are you still working with Alexander?" "No." "Why?" "I resigned." Claire nodded. "Good." Vanessa looked down. "I wanted to tell you something." Claire's expression hardened slightly. "What?" "Alexander didn't tell me everything." Claire waited. "He made me believe your marriage had been over emotionally for years." Claire looked away. "I know. I believed him." "I know. But I eventually realized he was telling me only the parts that made him feel justified." Claire looked back at her. Vanessa continued. He never told me about the things you had done for him. What things? Your support during his father's illness. Claire said nothing. Your work with his foundation. Your mother. How you stayed with him when his company almost collapsed. Claire's eyes narrowed. How do you know about those things? He told me. That surprised her. Vanessa's voice softened. He talked about you more than you probably realize. Claire felt something uncomfortable move through her. That doesn't make it better. I know. No. Claire shook her head. It doesn't. Vanessa nodded. I just thought you should know. Claire stared at her. For months, Claire had imagined Vanessa as the opposite of herself. Confident, where Claire was quiet. Bold, where Claire was cautious. Perhaps she had imagined her as someone who had taken what belonged to her. But now, standing face to face, Claire saw something else. Vanessa wasn't a monster. She was a person who had made a terrible choice. And recognizing that didn't mean excusing it. Claire understood something important. People were complicated. You could dislike someone's actions without reducing them to a villain. That distinction helped Claire release some of the anger she had been carrying. Not all of it, but some. I don't hate you, Claire said. Vanessa looked surprised. You don't? No. Why? Because hatred would give you too much space in my life. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. Claire continued. But I won't pretend what happened was acceptable. I understand. Good. Claire turned to leave. Vanessa stopped her. Claire? She looked back. I hope you find happiness. Claire thought about it, then smiled. I hope I do too. She walked away. For the first time, Vanessa didn't feel like a rival. She felt like part of a chapter Claire was ready to close. But the evening wasn't over. When Claire returned home, Alexander was waiting in the library. He looked concerned. How was the gala? Fine. Did you see Vanessa? Claire stopped. Yes. Alexander's expression changed. What did she say? She apologized. Did she tell you anything else? She said you talked about me. He looked down. I did. What did you say? Alexander hesitated. That I missed you. Claire's heart tightened. He continued. That I missed who we were. She looked at him. And that I was angry at myself for destroying something I didn't know how to appreciate. Claire was silent. Alexander sat down. I never stopped loving you. Claire looked at him. Alexander, I know. No. She shook her head. You keep saying that. Because it's true. I believe that you loved me. He looked relieved. But that doesn't make what you did less wrong. His relief disappeared. I know. Love isn't an excuse. I know. Love doesn't cancel betrayal. I know. Love doesn't automatically restore trust. I know. Claire sat across from him. Then maybe we're finally understanding each other. Alexander smiled sadly. Maybe. They sat there. Two people who had once believed love meant never needing to explain themselves. Now learning that love sometimes required explaining everything. Alexander looked at her. Can I ask you something? What? If I had told you I was unhappy a year ago, what would you have done? Claire thought about it. I don't know. Would you have fought for us? Probably. Would you have changed? Some things. And if I had told you I wanted to leave? Claire looked down. I would have been devastated. But I would have survived. Alexander nodded. Claire continued. That's what you took from me. What? The chance to know the truth before you made decisions for both of us. Alexander's eyes lowered. I understand now. I hope you do. I do. Claire stood. I need to go. He nodded. As she reached the doorway, he said, Claire. She turned. Thank you for talking to me. She smiled faintly. Don't thank me yet. Why? Because I'm still angry. He nodded. I know. And I'm still hurt. I know. And I don't know whether I can ever trust you again. Alexander looked directly at her. I know. Claire nodded. This time, his answer didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like acceptance. She walked away. But later that night, something unexpected happened. Claire found herself standing outside Alexander's study. The door was open. He was sitting at his desk, not working, just staring at an old photograph. She recognized it. Their wedding. Claire knocked softly against the frame. Alexander looked up. Hey. She stepped inside. What are you looking at? Our wedding. Claire approached. She looked at the photograph. They were young, happy, certain. You look terrified, she said. He smiled. I was. Why? Because I knew I had something to lose. Claire looked at him. And now? Alexander looked at the photograph. Now I know I should have been more afraid of losing you. Claire didn't answer. She didn't want to give him false hope. But she also didn't want to punish him for speaking honestly. So she simply said, "Good night, Alexander." "Good night." She left. And as she walked down the hallway, Claire realized something. For months, she had thought healing meant forgetting. Now she understood that healing wasn't forgetting what happened. It was remembering without allowing the memory to control your future. She could remember the betrayal. She could remember the lies. She could remember the pain. And still choose what happened next. That choice belonged to her. No longer to Alexander. No longer to Vanessa. No longer to her childhood. No longer to the fear she had inherited from her mother. For the first time in her life, Claire understood that silence wasn't her only protection. She had a voice. She simply had to learn how to use it. And she was going to need that voice very soon. Because Alexander had one more truth to tell her. A truth that would force Claire to confront the question she had been avoiding since the night she came home early. Was their marriage worth saving? Or had the woman who spent 11 years protecting it finally learned that protecting yourself had to come first? The truth Alexander had been avoiding didn't come the next morning. It came 2 days later. Claire was in the garden when he found her. It was early Sunday afternoon, and the August sun hung softly over Manhattan. Claire sat beneath the shade of an old maple tree with a book resting open on her lap. She wasn't reading. She had been staring at the same paragraph for nearly 10 minutes. Alexander stopped several feet away. "Can I sit?" Claire looked up. "Sure." He sat on the opposite side of the bench. For a while, neither spoke. A breeze moved through the leaves. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a car horn sounded. Ordinary noises. Normal life. Claire had become strangely grateful for ordinary things. They reminded her that her entire world had not ended. Alexander looked at her. "I need to tell you something." Claire closed her book. "Okay." He took a breath. "Before I met Vanessa, I had already started thinking about leaving." Claire's expression barely changed. "When?" "About 1.5 years ago." She looked at him. "So, before the affair?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of making it real." Claire looked down. Alexander continued. "I kept telling myself I needed more time." "Time to decide?" "Yes." "But we're already making decisions." "I know. You were emotionally leaving while still letting me believe we were married." Alexander nodded. "Yes." Claire breathed slowly. That truth hurt in a way the affair hadn't. Because an affair had a beginning. This had apparently been happening inside Alexander long before Vanessa. "Did you stop loving me then?" "No." "Then why?" "I don't know." Claire looked at him. "You have to know something." "I felt trapped." The word landed heavily. Claire stared at him. "Trapped? I don't mean by you." "Then what do you mean?" "By myself." He looked toward the garden. I had spent my entire life building an identity around being successful, being strong, being responsible, being the man who always knew what to do. He laughed quietly. "But when our marriage started changing, I didn't know how to fix it." Claire listened. "I felt like I was failing." "You could have told me." "I know." "You could have said, 'I'm scared.'" "I know." "You could have said, 'I don't know how to be your husband anymore.'" "I know." Claire's voice cracked. "You could have given me a chance to meet you there." Alexander looked at her. "I was ashamed." Claire went silent. That word again. Shame. She understood it. Perhaps too well. Her mother had been ashamed. Claire had been ashamed. Alexander had been ashamed. And shame had taught all three of them to hide. "You were ashamed of needing help." "Yes." "And instead of telling me, you found someone who didn't know enough about you to see how lost you were." Alexander didn't answer. Claire nodded. "That makes sense." He looked at her. "Does it?" "No." She shook her head. "I understand it. That's different." Alexander lowered his eyes. Claire continued. "Understanding why someone hurts you doesn't mean the wound disappears." "I know. Sometimes people think if they explain their reasons, the other person has to forgive them. I don't expect that." "Good." They sat quietly. Then Claire asked, "Did you ever plan to tell me?" Alexander hesitated. "Yes." "When?" "I don't know." Claire gave a sad smile. "That's the problem." "What?" "You kept waiting for the perfect moment to have an honest conversation." She shook her head. "There isn't one." Alexander looked at her. "You're right. There is only the moment when you decide the truth is more important than your comfort." He nodded. Claire looked at the garden. That's what I wish you had understood. I do now. She believed him. That surprised her. Not completely, but enough. Alexander wasn't asking her to trust him. He was simply telling the truth. And Claire realized that honesty had a strange quality. It didn't immediately repair anything, but it made reality easier to see. Alexander? Yes? Do you want to save this marriage? He looked at her. Yes. The answer came immediately. Claire looked away. I don't know if I do. I understand. No, I don't think you do. She looked back at him. I've spent 11 years thinking about how to make our marriage work. She paused. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether I was happy. Alexander said nothing. I don't want to go back. I don't want that either. You don't? No. Claire frowned. I don't want the marriage we had. She stared at him. I want something healthier. Maybe. He nodded. If you ever decide you want to try again. Claire studied him. You understand that trying again wouldn't mean forgetting. I know. It wouldn't mean moving back into the same bedroom tomorrow. I know. It wouldn't mean trusting you immediately. I know. It wouldn't even mean staying married. Alexander nodded. I know. Claire looked at him for several seconds. Then maybe there is something worth exploring. His face changed. Hope appeared. Claire noticed immediately. Don't. He stopped. Don't turn that into a promise. I won't. I'm not saying we're getting back together. I understand. I'm saying I'm willing to see whether the person you are becoming is someone I could trust again. Alexander nodded. That's enough. Claire stood. Good. She picked up her book. Then Alexander said, There's something else. She stopped. What? I've started therapy. Claire looked at him. I know. You knew? Your assistant mentioned it. Alexander smiled faintly. I didn't want you to think I was doing it for you. Are you? No. He shook his head. I'm doing it because I don't want to become this person again. Claire nodded. That mattered. Not because therapy could erase the affair. It couldn't. But because real change had to exist independently of whether Claire stayed. She had learned something important. If someone changes only because they are afraid of losing you, the change may disappear once they feel secure again. But if they change because they finally understand themselves, there is a chance the change can last. Claire wasn't ready to trust Alexander, but she was willing to observe. That was different. Over the next several weeks, they began rebuilding something neither of them had expected. Not a marriage. Not yet. A conversation. They had dinner once a week. No phones. No business calls. No distractions. They talked. At first, the conversations were uncomfortable. Claire talked about things she had buried. Alexander talked about fears he had never admitted. They discussed money, family, childhood, intimacy, resentment, loneliness, expectations. They talked about the things couples often avoid because saying them aloud makes them real. One evening, Claire asked, When did you first feel alone in our marriage? Alexander thought for a long time. About 3 years ago. Claire looked at him. 3 years? Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I thought it would pass. She nodded. That's what I thought too. Alexander looked surprised. You felt alone? Claire laughed softly. Of course. Why didn't you tell me? Because I thought you were happy. Alexander stared at her. How could you think that? Because you never complained. He smiled sadly. Neither did you. They both laughed. It was the first genuine laugh they had shared in months, and then the laughter faded, because they realized something painful. They had both been waiting for the other person to start the conversation. Neither had. That was how distance became normal. One night, Claire said, We both failed at communication. Alexander nodded. Yes. But we didn't both fail in the same way. No. Claire looked at him. You chose betrayal. I did. I chose silence. I know. And my silence may have contributed to the distance. It did. But it didn't cause the affair. Alexander shook his head immediately. No. Claire watched him. Say it again. My choices caused the affair. She nodded. Good. That distinction mattered. Claire didn't want to become one of those people who blamed themselves for someone else's betrayal. She could take responsibility for her silence without taking responsibility for Alexander's dishonesty. That was part of healing too. Learning where your responsibility ends. Another month passed. Claire began wearing simple jewelry again. But not her wedding ring. Alexander never asked. One afternoon, they attended a foundation event together. It was the first public appearance they had made as a pair since the affair became known among their social circle. People watched them. Whispers followed. Claire noticed. Alexander noticed too. He leaned toward her. "We can leave." Claire shook her head. "No." "You sure?" "Yes." She smiled. "I'm not going to let gossip decide where I stand." They entered the ballroom. A reporter approached. "Mr. Whitmore, are the rumors about your marriage true?" Alexander looked at Claire. She gave him a small nod. He turned back to the reporter. "Our marriage is private." The reporter tried again. "Are you separated?" Alexander didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "We're working through personal matters." That was all. No lies. No public blame. No attempt to protect his image at Claire's expense. They walked away. Claire looked at him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not making me the villain." Alexander shook his head. "You were never the villain." They continued walking. Then Claire stopped. "Alexander." "Yes?" "I want to ask you something." "Anything." "If we do this, if we actually try again, what happens when you're unhappy?" He thought about it. "I tell you." "And if you're angry?" "I tell you." "If you're afraid?" "I tell you." "If you don't know what you want?" "I tell you that too." Claire smiled. "And if I don't want to hear it?" Alexander looked at her. "I tell you anyway." She laughed softly. "That's better." He smiled. Then she added, "And what happens if I disappoint you?" "I talk to you." "What if I hurt you?" "I talk to you." "What if we fight?" "We fight." She raised an eyebrow. "And?" "We don't disappear." Claire nodded. That was the answer she had needed. Not a promise that they would never hurt each other. That wasn't realistic. A healthy relationship wasn't one where nobody ever caused pain. It was one where people learned how to address pain before it became resentment. That night, Claire returned home, alone. She stood in front of the mirror. Her wedding ring remained in the drawer. She opened it, picked it up, held it, then placed it back. Not yet. She wasn't ready. And she no longer felt guilty for that. For years, Claire had believed that being a good wife meant being patient. Now she understood that being a good wife did not require her to abandon herself. Love required two people. Trust required consistency. And forgiveness required freedom. Nobody could demand it. Claire walked toward the window. The city stretched endlessly before her. She thought about the woman she had been when she first met Alexander. Young. Hopeful. Quiet. She thought about the woman she was now. Still hopeful. Still capable of love. But no longer quiet when something mattered. That was the real change. Not whether Alexander came back. Not whether their marriage survived. Claire had found something more important. Her voice. And once a person finds their voice after years of silence, they rarely become the same person again. But there was still one question left. Could Alexander's actions match his words? Because Claire had learned a lesson the hard way. Promises can sound beautiful. Patterns tell the truth. And she was about to watch Alexander closely. Not to punish him. Not to test him. But because trust could no longer be built on what he said. It had to be built on what he consistently did. Before we move into the next chapter, I want to ask you something. Claire finally learned that understanding someone's reasons does not mean excusing what they did. So, let me ask you, if someone betrayed you but genuinely took responsibility, changed their behavior, and gave you the space to heal, would you ever consider trusting them again? Or once trust is broken, is the relationship never truly the same? Tell me your honest answer in the comments. And if Claire's journey is speaking to you, don't forget to like this story and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. Your support helps us continue creating powerful stories about love, betrayal, healing, and the difficult choices life forces us to make. But stay with me, because Claire has stopped listening to Alexander's promises. From this point forward, she's going to watch his actions. And what she discovers next will force her to decide whether Alexander is truly changing, or simply afraid of losing her. Let's continue. Trust did not return because Alexander apologized. It did not return because he went to therapy. It did not return because he stopped seeing Vanessa. And it certainly did not return because Claire still loved him. Trust had become something much more demanding. It needed evidence, not promises, not flowers, not expensive gifts. Evidence. And Claire had finally learned the difference. For the first time in their marriage, she wasn't watching Alexander because she was suspicious. She was watching because she was paying attention. There was a difference. Suspicion searched for reasons to confirm fear. Attention simply observed reality. And reality, Claire discovered, was complicated. Alexander really was changing. But change didn't erase history. One morning, Claire found him sitting at the kitchen table. He was reading a report. His phone was beside him. Face up, She noticed it. He noticed her, noticing. Neither said anything. Then Alexander smiled. "Good morning." "Good morning." "I made coffee." Claire looked toward the machine. "You made coffee?" "I tried." She smiled. "That's dangerous." He laughed. "I know." She poured herself a cup. They stood in the kitchen together. It felt almost normal. Almost. Then Claire remembered that normal was no longer the goal. Healthy was. She sat across from him. "How was therapy?" Alexander looked surprised. "Good." "What did you talk about?" He hesitated. "Me." Claire smiled faintly. "That's probably a good place to start." He nodded. "I talked about control." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You have control issues?" He laughed. "I've been told." "By me?" "Among others." Claire smiled. The moment was small, but it mattered. Because their conversations were becoming easier. Not because the past was gone. Because they had stopped pretending it hadn't happened. Alexander closed the report. "My therapist asked me something yesterday." "What?" "Why, I thought I had to solve everything alone." Claire looked at him. "What did you say?" "I didn't know." She waited. "Then I realized something." "What?" "My father taught me that needing people made you weak." Claire nodded slowly. "Mine taught me that needing people made you vulnerable." Alexander looked at her. "That's interesting." "Why?" "We learned opposite lessons from different parents, and ended up doing the same thing." He nodded. "We both learned how to survive without asking for help." Claire looked down at her coffee. "Except you hurt someone when you did it." Alexander accepted the correction. Yes. There was no defensiveness. Claire appreciated that. Not because it changed anything, because it showed her he was beginning to understand accountability. The following week, Alexander received an invitation to a business conference in London. He came to Claire before accepting. "I'm supposed to leave Thursday." She looked up from her laptop. "Okay. I wanted to tell you." "Why?" "Because I don't want you to hear about it from someone else." Claire smiled. "Thank you. I'll be gone 5 days." "Okay. If that makes you uncomfortable, I can—" "No." She stopped him. "You have a business." "I know. You don't need to stop living because I'm healing." Alexander nodded. "Thank you." Claire returned to her laptop. Then she looked up. "Just be honest with me." "I will." He left. Claire watched him walk away. There was something freeing about realizing she didn't need to monitor him. She could not control whether Alexander betrayed her again. She could control what she would do if he did. That was enough. 3 days into the trip, Claire received a message. "Conference went well. I'm heading back to the hotel." She replied, "Glad to hear it." A minute later, "I miss you." Claire stared at the screen. Her heart reacted before her mind could. She typed, "I miss you too." Then she sent it. She wasn't ashamed. She still loved him. Healing didn't require pretending she didn't. But she also knew that love wasn't proof of safety. When Alexander returned, he brought no gifts. Claire noticed. Instead, he brought home a photograph. It was a picture of the two of them from their first trip to Chicago. "I found this in an old file," he said. Claire took it. She smiled. "You look ridiculous." "I was 29. You were still ridiculous." He laughed. She looked at the photograph again. "Thank you." He nodded. That night, they had dinner. They talked for almost 2 hours. Not about the affair. About everything else. Books, politics, the foundation, a new restaurant, a documentary Claire had watched. They laughed. And for a moment, Claire forgot to be careful. She forgot to measure every word. She forgot to wonder whether she was making a mistake. She simply enjoyed being with him. Then Alexander reached across the table. He stopped before touching her hand. He waited. Claire looked at his hand. Then, at him. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. He didn't squeeze it. He simply held it. The gesture lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then Claire pulled away. Not because she was rejecting him. Because she needed to breathe. Alexander understood. That was progress. Real progress. But progress didn't mean there were no setbacks. 2 weeks later, Claire overheard a conversation between Alexander and one of his executives. The executive said, "Vanessa's replacement isn't working." Claire froze. Alexander responded, "We'll find someone else." The executive continued, "Vanessa knew the accounts better than anyone." Claire walked away. She didn't ask immediately. But the old fear returned. She hated how quickly it happened. One sentence, one name, and suddenly, the past was standing in the room again. That evening, Alexander noticed she was quiet. "What happened?" "Nothing." He looked at her. "Claire," she sighed. I heard you talking about Vanessa. His expression changed. Okay. You weren't planning to bring her back? No. You're sure? Yes. Claire nodded. He didn't become defensive. He didn't tell her she was being paranoid. Instead, he asked, "Do you want to know what happened?" Yes. He explained. The company had lost a major client. Vanessa had knowledge that could help transition the account. Alexander had decided against bringing her back personally. I won't work with her again, he said. Claire looked at him. You didn't have to explain. I know, but I want you to know. She nodded. Thank you. Alexander paused. Can I tell you something? What? Your question didn't bother me. Claire looked surprised. Why? Because you asked, instead of assuming. That stayed with her. He was right. The old Claire would have remained silent. She would have watched, wondered, maybe searched, then suffered alone. The new Claire asked. It didn't guarantee the answer would be comforting, but it guaranteed she would know where she stood. That mattered. Weeks passed. Claire's therapist asked her a difficult question. If Alexander had never cheated, would you have been happy with the marriage you had? Claire sat silently. She didn't know. The therapist waited. Finally, Claire said, no. The word frightened her. Why? Because I was lonely. Before the affair? Yes. Did you tell him? Not clearly. Why? Claire thought. Because I thought being lonely was something I needed to fix in myself. The therapist nodded. That's an important realization. Claire looked down. I thought if I became more understanding, more patient, less demanding, he would come closer. And did he? No. Why? Because he didn't know what I needed. Claire paused. And I didn't tell him. That realization changed something. For years, Claire had blamed herself too much. Now she was beginning to blame herself correctly. Not for Alexander's affair, but for abandoning her own voice. There was a difference. She could acknowledge her mistakes without taking ownership of someone else's. That was one of the most important lessons she had learned. Taking responsibility should create growth. It should not create shame. One Friday evening, Claire came home from work and found Alexander in the kitchen. He was cooking. She stared. What are you doing? Cooking. You? Yes. Should I call someone? He laughed. I can cook. Since when? Since YouTube. Claire smiled. What are you making? Pasta. She looked at the counter. There were vegetables everywhere. That's not pasta. I'm aware. She laughed. He looked at her. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Claire said, I missed this. Alexander's smile faded slightly. This? This. She gestured toward the kitchen. Us being stupid together. He smiled. I missed it too. They cooked together. The meal was terrible. The sauce was too salty. The pasta was overcooked. Claire laughed so hard she nearly cried. Alexander watched her. What? Nothing. Why are you looking at me? I haven't heard you laugh like that in a long time. Claire's smile faded slightly. Neither have I. That night, they sat on the back porch. No phones. No distractions. Claire leaned back in her chair. I think I understand something now. Alexander looked at her. What? We were both waiting for the other person to save the marriage. He nodded. Yes. But marriages don't save themselves. No. They need two people willing to tell the truth. Yes. Claire looked at him. That's what I want if we ever try again. Alexander's voice was quiet. What? Truth. He nodded. Even when it's ugly. Especially then. She smiled. Even when you're angry. Especially then. Even when you're afraid. He nodded. Especially then. They sat quietly, but this time, the silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like understanding. Claire looked at Alexander. I'm not ready to come back. He nodded. I know, but I'm not walking away either. His eyes lifted. Claire continued. I'm watching. He smiled faintly. I know. And I'm going slowly. I know. And if I ever feel like I'm losing myself again, I'll listen. Claire nodded. That was all she needed. Not a guarantee that they would never fail. A commitment to speak when they did. Later that night, Claire returned to the guest bedroom. She opened the drawer. Her wedding ring was still there. She picked it up. For the first time in months, she placed it on her finger. She stared at it, then removed it again. Not yet, but perhaps someday. She placed it back inside the drawer, then closed it. Claire smiled. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't running. She wasn't waiting. She was choosing. And for a woman who had spent most of her life believing that silence was the only way to keep love, learning to choose was its own kind of freedom. But the hardest part of rebuilding trust was still ahead. Because Alexander's betrayal had created one question Claire couldn't answer yet: could she forgive him without betraying herself? And before she could answer that, Alexander would have to face the consequences of what he had done in a way that went far beyond apologizing to his wife. Alexander learned that consequences were quieter than punishment. There was no dramatic courtroom, no newspaper headline, no public humiliation, no angry crowd waiting outside his office. The consequences simply followed him into ordinary moments. They followed him when he woke up and reached across an empty bed. They followed him when Claire didn't automatically tell him where she was going. They followed him when she laughed with someone else and he realized he no longer had the right to assume that laugh belonged to him. They followed him when he looked at the woman he loved and understood that love alone couldn't rebuild what his choices had damaged. For a man who had spent most of his life solving problems with money, influence, and determination, this was unbearable. Because there was nothing to purchase, nothing to negotiate, nothing to force. He could only wait. And waiting was something Alexander had never been good at. One Monday morning, he sat in his office reviewing financial reports when his assistant entered. "Mr. Whitmore?" Alexander looked up. "Yes?" "The board meeting has been moved to Thursday." "Fine." She hesitated. "There is one other thing." "What?" "Vanessa has formally withdrawn from all remaining consulting work." Alexander nodded. "Okay." She asked whether she should send the transition documents directly to you. Alexander paused. "No." His assistant looked surprised. "Who should receive them?" "David, all right?" She turned to leave. "Wait." She stopped. "Make sure Vanessa's work is properly compensated." "Of course. And make sure nobody treats her differently because of what happened personally." His assistant nodded. "I understand." When she left, Alexander leaned back in his chair. He wasn't protecting Vanessa. He wasn't defending her choices. He simply understood something he hadn't understood before. A person's mistakes didn't give you permission to become cruel. He had betrayed Claire. He didn't want that betrayal to turn him into someone who destroyed everyone around him. He looked at the photograph on his desk. It was an old picture of Claire standing beside a school in Baltimore. She had been laughing. Alexander had taken it years ago. Before the distance. Before Vanessa. Before everything. He picked it up, then put it back. He had begun to understand that missing the old Claire was not enough. If he wanted any future with her, he had to become someone worthy of the woman she was becoming. That meant confronting himself. Not performing regret. Not appearing remorseful. Actually changing. That afternoon, Alexander's therapist asked him a question. "What do you think you lost?" Alexander answered immediately. "My marriage." The therapist waited. "Anything else?" Alexander thought. "My wife's trust." "Anything else?" He looked down. "My idea of myself." The therapist nodded. "Explain." Alexander took a breath. "I always thought I was a good man. You were successful. I thought they were the same thing." "They aren't." "I know that now." The therapist leaned back. "What made you believe being successful made you good?" Alexander thought about his father. "Because that's how I was raised." "Tell me." "My father measured everything. Money, grades, performance, results. If you succeeded, you were valuable. And if you failed, you hid it." The therapist nodded. "How did that affect your marriage?" Alexander stared at the floor. "When Claire and I started having problems, I felt like I was failing." "And what did you do?" "I hid it. Then, I found someone who made me feel successful again." The therapist didn't respond immediately. Alexander continued. "Vanessa admired me. Claire didn't." "She did. Then what's the difference?" Alexander's answer came slowly. "Claire knew me." The words sat heavily in the room. "She knew when I was scared. She knew when I was lying. She knew when I was exhausted. She knew when I was pretending to be fine." He swallowed. "Vanessa only saw the version of me I wanted her to see." The therapist nodded. "Which version was easier to love?" Alexander closed his eyes. "The fake one." That realization hurt, but it was necessary, because betrayal often begins long before the physical act. It can begin when someone starts presenting a version of themselves that they know is easier for another person to admire. Alexander had not simply hidden Vanessa from Claire, he had hidden himself, and he had used another relationship to escape the discomfort of being known. When he returned home that evening, Claire was in the library. He stopped at the doorway. "Can I come in?" She looked up. "Sure." He sat down. They remained quiet for a moment. Then Alexander said, "I learned something today." Claire smiled faintly. "You're learning a lot lately." I know. What did you learn? He looked at her. I think I cheated, because I wanted to feel like a different version of myself. Claire closed her book. What do you mean? I felt like I was failing. In the marriage? In everything. He paused. Business was changing. My father was sick. I was afraid I wasn't the man everyone thought I was. Claire listened, and Vanessa made me feel impressive. Claire's expression remained neutral. I understand. Alexander looked surprised. You do? Yes. She paused. But I don't want you to use that as an excuse. I'm not. Good. He nodded. I did what I did, because I made a choice. Claire looked at him. That's important. Why? Because if you blame your childhood, your stress, your business, or Vanessa, then you're still giving someone else control over your decisions. Alexander nodded. You're right. Claire leaned back. You don't need to prove you're a good man to me. He looked at her. Then what do I need to do? Be one. The simplicity of the answer silenced him. Claire continued. Not for me. She pointed gently toward him. For yourself. Alexander nodded. I will. That night, they didn't discuss the marriage. They talked about Claire's foundation. A new education program was opening in Baltimore. Alexander offered financial support. Claire shook her head. You don't have to. I know. Then why? Because I believe in it. She smiled. Then donate anonymously. Alexander laughed. You don't trust me with publicity. I don't trust you with anything yet. He smiled. Fair? The following month, Claire traveled to Baltimore for the foundation. She spent 3 days working with local educators. One evening, she visited her old neighborhood. The brick house where she grew up was still there. The paint had changed. The porch looked smaller. The windows were different, but the driveway remained. Claire stood outside for several minutes. Her mother had moved years ago. The house belonged to someone else now. Still, memories returned. Her father's car, her mother's silence, her younger self sitting on the staircase. She remembered believing that if she could just stay quiet enough, everything would eventually become okay. She smiled sadly. Then her phone rang. Alexander. She answered. Hi. Hi. Everything okay? Yes. What are you doing? Standing outside my old house. Alexander went quiet. Are you okay? Claire looked at the windows. Yeah. She smiled. I think I'm saying goodbye. To the house? To the girl I was. Alexander didn't interrupt. Claire appreciated that. She did the best she could. Yes. She thought silence was the only way to survive. Alexander's voice was gentle. Maybe she was right at the time. Claire smiled. Maybe. She looked at the front door. But I don't need that survival skill anymore. They remained on the phone for a while. Neither felt the need to fill the silence. Then Claire said, I should go. Okay. Good night. Good night. She hung up. And something inside her felt lighter. Not because Alexander had called. Because she had finally separated her present from her past. She wasn't 14 anymore. She wasn't responsible for protecting her mother from pain. She wasn't responsible for keeping a marriage intact at any cost. She wasn't responsible for making Alexander comfortable. She was responsible for herself. When Claire returned to New York, Alexander was waiting at the airport. She hadn't asked him to come. He hadn't told her he would. He simply stood near the entrance. Claire smiled. What are you doing here? I wanted to see you. She looked at him. How did you know my flight? You sent me the itinerary. Claire thought. She had. She had forgotten. He took her suitcase. How was Baltimore? Good. Did you see your old house? Yes. How did it feel? Smaller? Alexander laughed. Everything from childhood feels smaller when you grow up. That's true. They walked toward the car. Halfway there, Claire stopped. Alexander? Yes? Thank you. For what? For not asking me to hurry. He looked at her. I know. She smiled. You really are learning that phrase. He laughed. Apparently. The drive home was quiet. Not awkward. Comfortable. When they reached the townhouse, Claire carried her suitcase upstairs. She stopped outside the master bedroom. The door was open. The room looked different. Alexander had removed several of his belongings. He had taken down photographs. Not because he wanted to erase the marriage, because he wanted Claire to decide what belonged there. She looked at him. Why did you do this? Because it was your room too. Claire looked around. It still is. Alexander didn't move. Claire walked inside. She touched the edge of the dresser, then looked at the empty space where one of their wedding photographs had been. Where's the picture? Stored. Why? I didn't want to make decisions about what you should see. Claire nodded. That mattered. She didn't move into the bedroom. Not yet. But she stayed there for several minutes. Then she said, maybe someday. Alexander didn't ask what she meant. He simply nodded. That night, Claire slept in the guest room. But she slept better than she had in months. Not because she had decided to stay, because she had stopped feeling trapped. The next morning, she opened her journal. She wrote, "Trust isn't rebuilt when someone promises never to hurt you again." She paused, then continued, "It's rebuilt when they understand that hurting you has consequences, and they respect those consequences without trying to rush your healing." She closed the journal. That was what Alexander was doing. He was waiting, listening, changing. But there was another truth Claire had to face. She was beginning to love him again. Not the old version of him. Not the man she had imagined him to be. The real man. Flawed, fearful, capable of terrible choices, but also capable of accountability. And that frightened her. Because loving him again meant risking trust again. And trust was the one thing she could no longer give blindly. A week later, they sat together on the back porch. Claire looked at him. "I think I'm ready to tell you something." Alexander waited. "I forgive you." His eyes widened. But before he could speak, she raised a hand. "Don't misunderstand me." He stopped. "Forgiveness doesn't mean we're back together. I understand. It doesn't mean I trust you completely. I know. It doesn't mean what happened was acceptable. I know." Claire looked toward the garden. "It means I don't want to carry the anger anymore." Alexander's eyes filled. "Thank you." Claire smiled. "I'm doing it for me." "I know." She looked at him. "And that's the difference." For years, Claire had thought forgiveness was something you gave another person. Now she understood that sometimes forgiveness was simply refusing to let someone else's choices control the rest of your life. Alexander reached toward her hand. He stopped before touching it. Claire noticed. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. This time, she didn't pull away. They sat there quietly. No promises. No declarations. No dramatic reunion. Just two people sitting in the same place, finally understanding that love was not about avoiding pain. It was about learning how to face it honestly. And yet, Claire knew they still had one final mountain to climb. Forgiving Alexander had been easier than trusting him, because forgiveness could happen inside her. Trust required evidence from him, and there was one thing Alexander hadn't yet proven, that he could choose honesty when honesty was difficult. Soon, he would be given exactly that opportunity, and the choice he made would determine whether Claire could finally open her heart again, or whether their story would end with forgiveness, but without reconciliation. The opportunity came on a Thursday morning. Alexander was in his office when his phone rang. The name on the screen made him pause. Vanessa. He stared at it for several seconds. She hadn't called him since leaving the company. He almost ignored the call. Then he answered. "Hello?" "Alexander." Her voice was quiet. "What happened?" "I need to tell you something." He leaned back. "Go ahead." "There is a problem with the Chicago account." "What kind of problem?" "The client is threatening to terminate the contract." Alexander frowned. "Why?" "Because the transition documents are incomplete." He closed his eyes. Of course, the account Vanessa had managed was complicated. "Can you send everything to David?" "I did." "And?" "They're saying some of the information isn't there." Alexander looked at his desk. "Can you come in and explain?" There was silence. "I don't think that's a good idea." Alexander understood why. Neither did he. "You're right. I can explain over the phone." "Okay." They spent 20 minutes discussing the account. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, purely business. When the call ended, Alexander sat quietly. He had done nothing wrong. But he knew exactly what Claire would feel if she discovered he had spoken to Vanessa without telling her. And that was the test. The old Alexander would have hidden the call. He would have told himself it was unnecessary. He would have avoided an uncomfortable conversation. The new Alexander knew better. He walked downstairs. Claire was in the dining room working on her laptop. He stood in the doorway. "Can we talk?" She looked up. "Sure. Vanessa called me this morning." Claire's fingers stopped moving. "Why?" He explained. "Business. The account. The missing documents. Nothing more." Claire listened. "Did you speak to her?" "Yes." "How long?" "About 20 minutes." She nodded. "Okay." Alexander waited. "Are you angry?" Claire thought about it. "No." "Uncomfortable?" "Yes." He nodded. "I thought you might be." Claire closed her laptop. "I appreciate you telling me. I almost didn't." Claire looked at him. "Why?" "Because I was afraid you'd be upset." She smiled sadly. That's exactly why you needed to tell me. I know. She stood. Thank you. Alexander looked relieved, but Claire wasn't finished. There's something else. What? I don't want you to tell me everything because you're afraid of my reaction. He frowned. What do you mean? I want you to tell me because honesty is who you are becoming. Alexander nodded slowly. You're right. If you only tell me the truth when you're scared, I'll find out. Then you're still hiding. That sentence hit him. He understood. The goal wasn't confession. The goal was character. Claire didn't want a husband who reported his behavior to her like an employee submitting a weekly report. She wanted a man who naturally chose honesty. Alexander looked at her. How do I become that person? Claire smiled. You practice. Practice? Yes. How? Tell the truth when it's inconvenient. He nodded. Tell the truth when it makes you look bad. He nodded again. Tell the truth when you think it might cost you something. Alexander looked at her. And if it costs me you? Claire's expression softened. Then you still tell the truth. The words hung between them. That was the moment Alexander understood. Claire wasn't asking him to guarantee that she would stay. She was asking him to become honest enough to accept the possibility that she might leave. That was real accountability, not control, not manipulation. Acceptance. That evening, they had dinner together. Claire poured wine. Alexander looked at her. I've been thinking about what you said. Which part? That I need to tell the truth, even if it costs me you. She nodded. I don't think I've ever lived that way. Most people don't. Why? Because we're afraid. Alexander smiled. You're becoming very philosophical. Claire laughed. I'm learning. He raised his glass. To learning. She touched her glass against his. To learning. They drank. Then Claire asked, what are you most afraid of? Alexander looked at her. Right now? Yes. He thought. Losing you. Claire waited. And? Being alone. She nodded. Anything else? Alexander stared at the table. That I might never forgive myself. Claire's expression softened. That's not your job. What? Forgiving yourself. He looked at her. You have to take responsibility first. I know, but you can't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself. Alexander was quiet. Why? Because guilt can become another form of selfishness. He looked confused. Claire explained. If you spend all your time thinking about how terrible you feel, eventually the focus becomes you again. Alexander nodded slowly. That's true. Regret should teach you. She paused. It shouldn't become your identity. That became one of the most important conversations they had ever had. They talked for hours about guilt, about shame, about fear, about trust, about what happened, about what didn't happen. At one point, Alexander asked, do you think we're different people now? Claire thought about it. Yes. Better? She smiled. Different. He laughed. That's diplomatic. It's honest. He nodded. Later that night, Claire stood in the hallway. Alexander was about to go upstairs. Alexander? He turned. Yes? I want to ask you something. Okay. Why did you really stay? He looked confused. Stay? After the affair. Alexander thought. I love you. Claire shook her head. That's part of it. He waited. Why didn't you leave? Alexander looked away. Because I was afraid. Of what? Starting over. Claire nodded. And? Because, despite everything, you were still home. Claire's expression softened. He continued. You were the person I wanted to tell things to. She stared at him. Even after you cheated? Especially then. Why? Because every time something happened, my first instinct was still to tell you. Claire's eyes filled. Then why did you choose someone else? Alexander closed his eyes. I don't know. Claire waited. I think I wanted escape. From what? From the version of myself I couldn't stand. She nodded slowly. That's honest. I wish I had been honest before. So do I. They stood quietly. Then Claire said, Good night. Good night. She walked away. That night, she slept with her bedroom door slightly open. Not because she expected Alexander to enter, because she no longer needed to lock herself away from him. The next morning, something happened that Claire didn't expect. Alexander left a note on the kitchen counter. Not a love letter. Not an apology. Just 3 sentences. I am going to the office. I'll be home by 7. If that changes, I'll tell you. Claire smiled. It was such a small thing. But after everything, small things mattered. He had learned that reliability wasn't built through grand gestures. It was built through consistency. 7 o'clock came. Alexander arrived at 6:54. Claire looked at the clock. You actually made it. I said 7. You did. He smiled. I thought I'd surprise you. You did. They laughed. The evening was ordinary, and ordinary had become precious. Then, around 9, Alexander received an email. He read it. His expression changed. Claire noticed. What is it? He hesitated, then handed her the phone. She read the message. It was from the board. They wanted to know whether Alexander intended to publicly address rumors about his marriage. Claire looked at him. You don't have to. I know. What are you going to do? I don't know. Claire thought. You should decide what protects your privacy. He nodded. But don't lie. I won't. The next morning, Alexander addressed the board. He didn't disclose intimate details. He simply said, My wife and I are working through private family matters. I take responsibility for my personal conduct, and I ask that our privacy be respected. No excuses. No blame. No mention of Claire's shortcomings. No suggestion that their marriage had been failing because of her. The statement spread quickly. Claire saw it online. She stared at the screen. Then she called Alexander. Thank you. He sounded surprised. For what? For taking responsibility publicly without exposing me. I should have done that. Yes. There was a pause. Claire? Yes? Does that change anything? She thought. Yes. What? It tells me you're finally learning that protecting yourself doesn't require protecting yourself from the truth. Alexander smiled. I think I'm beginning to understand. They hung up. Claire sat quietly. She realized something. The marriage wasn't magically repaired, but something more important was happening. They were learning how to communicate. Not when everything was comfortable. When it wasn't. That was the skill they had lacked. And perhaps it was the skill they needed most. Later that week, Claire invited Alexander to dinner. He arrived at 7. She had cooked. They sat across from each other. After dinner, Claire said, I think we need to talk about the future. Alexander became still. Okay. I don't know what it looks like. I understand. But I don't want fear to decide it. He nodded. Neither do I. I don't want guilt to decide it either. Okay. I don't want loneliness to decide it. He nodded. And I don't want love alone to decide it. Alexander looked at her. What do you want? Claire took a slow breath. I want us to decide based on who we are now. He nodded. Not who we were. Yes. Not who we wish we were. Yes. Who we actually are. Claire smiled. Exactly. Alexander reached across the table. This time, Claire allowed him to hold her hand. Neither spoke. And in that silence, there was no hidden message. No secret. No manipulation. No fear. Just two people finally learning how to sit with the truth. But Claire knew one thing. If they were going to rebuild their marriage, they couldn't simply return to what they had before. They would need to create something entirely new. Something where difficult conversations were normal. Where boundaries weren't threats. Where honesty wasn't an emergency. And where silence could once again mean peace. But before they could reach that place, Claire needed to make one final decision. Not whether she could forgive Alexander. She had already begun to. The harder question was whether she could trust the man standing in front of her. And that answer would require time, consistency, and one final test neither of them saw coming. The final test arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. There was no dramatic warning, no suspicious message, no mysterious phone call. It came disguised as an opportunity. Alexander received an invitation to join a private investment consortium. The deal was enormous. If successful, it would expand Whitmore Global into a new international market and potentially add billions to the company's valuation. But there was a problem. One of the principal investors was connected to Vanessa, not directly, but closely enough that Alexander's legal team warned him the relationship could become complicated. His chief financial officer explained the situation during a meeting. If you want this deal, Vanessa may need to provide some historical documentation. Alexander leaned back. Can someone else provide it? Not easily. Then find another way. His CFO hesitated. The other option is to decline the deal. Alexander looked at the documents. For years, this would have been easy. He would have taken the deal. He would have solved the relationship issue privately. He would have told Claire later. But now, he knew better. He left the meeting and went home. Claire was sitting in the living room, reading. He stood in the doorway. Can I talk to you? She looked up. Of course. He sat down. He explained everything. The deal, the investor, the connection to Vanessa, the possible financial consequences. Claire listened carefully. When he finished, she asked, What do you want to do? I want the deal. She nodded. Then take it. Alexander looked surprised. You're sure? Why wouldn't I be? Because Vanessa is involved indirectly. Claire closed her book. Is she working with you? No. Will you meet her? Possibly. Will you be alone with her? I don't know. Claire thought about it, then said, then establish boundaries. Alexander nodded. And tell me. I will. But don't give up a billion-dollar opportunity because you're afraid I'll misunderstand. He looked at her. What if you do? Then we talk. What if you're angry? We talk. What if you think I'm making a mistake? We talk. Alexander smiled. You really like that word now. I do. He laughed. Then Claire became serious. Trust isn't about creating a world where nothing uncomfortable ever happens. She paused. It's about knowing we can talk when something uncomfortable does happen. Alexander nodded. I understand. The deal moved forward. Alexander refused to meet Vanessa privately. All communication went through the company's legal team. The documents were handled transparently. The investor accepted the arrangement. The deal closed 3 months later. The newspapers celebrated. Analysts called it one of Alexander's smartest moves. But Claire knew something more important had happened. Alexander had been given an opportunity to choose secrecy. He chose transparency. That was the kind of evidence trust needed. Not words. Choices. Consistent choices. 3 months later, Claire made another decision. She moved back into the master bedroom. Not because the marriage had been restored completely. Because she was ready to stop living in a room that represented the worst night of her life. She carried her belongings across the hallway. Alexander helped. He didn't say anything. He simply moved boxes. When everything was finished, Claire stood in the middle of the room. She looked around. Feels different. Alexander nodded. It does. She smiled. Good. That night, they slept in the same bed. They didn't have a dramatic reunion. They didn't pretend everything was fixed. They simply lay beside one another. Claire stared at the ceiling. Alexander was beside her. After several minutes, he said, Are you okay? Claire thought about it. Yes. Really? Yes. She turned toward him. I'm nervous. Me too. She smiled. That's okay. He nodded. They remained quiet. This silence was different. It wasn't the silence of two people avoiding a problem. It was the silence of two people who had finally said everything they needed to say for that night. The next morning, Claire woke before Alexander. She watched him sleeping. For a moment she remembered the woman she had been 11 years earlier. She had thought marriage meant finding someone who would never hurt you. Now she understood that was impossible. People were imperfect. Even people who loved you. Marriage couldn't guarantee safety from pain. What it could provide was a commitment to repair. A willingness to communicate. A willingness to take responsibility. A willingness to change. That morning, Claire got out of bed. She went downstairs. She made coffee. Then, Alexander appeared. You left. I was making coffee. He smiled. I thought you disappeared. Claire looked at him. Not anymore. He walked toward her. Good. She handed him a cup. Careful. Why? I made it. He laughed. Should I be worried? Always. They smiled. It wasn't the kind of romance Claire had imagined when she was young. It was better, because it wasn't built on fantasy. It was built on knowledge. They knew each other's weaknesses. They knew each other's fears. They knew what betrayal looked like. They knew what silence could become. And they were choosing to communicate anyway. A year after Claire came home early, she and Alexander returned to Chicago. The same city where they had first met. They visited the charity event venue. It had been renovated. The ballroom looked different. But Claire remembered. Alexander stood beside her. Do you remember? Everything. You were intimidating. I wasn't. You questioned my donation. Someone needed to. He smiled. You didn't care who I was. I cared. You did? Eventually. They laughed. Then they walked outside. The evening air was cool. Alexander stopped. Claire. She turned. He reached into his pocket. She immediately shook her head. No. He laughed. Wait. I know that look. I'm not proposing. She relaxed. He pulled out a small box. Inside was not a ring. It was a simple key. Claire stared at it. What is that? The key to the first apartment I bought. She looked confused. Why? I kept it. He placed it in her hand. I want you to have it. Why? Because that apartment was where I lived before I became a billionaire. Claire looked at him. It was before the company, before the money, before the reputation, before I became obsessed with proving myself. He paused. I want you to have something that reminds me who I was before I started believing success was more important than honesty. Claire looked at the key, then at him. That's beautiful. It's not a proposal. She smiled. I know. I don't want to ask you for anything. What are you asking me? Nothing. He shook his head. I just want you to know that if we build another life together, I don't want it built around money. Claire smiled. Then what? Truth. She nodded. Communication. Yes. Respect. Yes. Boundaries. Yes. And patience. Alexander smiled. Especially patience. Claire looked at him. I think we might have a chance. His eyes filled. A chance? Yes. At what? She smiled. At becoming something better than we were. He reached for her hand. This time, she took it willingly. They walked through the city together, not as the perfect billionaire couple, not as a storybook marriage, as two flawed people who had almost lost each other because neither knew how to speak honestly. The irony was not lost on Claire. The night she came home early had been the worst night of her life. But it had also been the night that finally forced the truth into their marriage. Without that night, they might have continued living quietly. They might have stayed together for years. They might have smiled at parties. They might have celebrated anniversaries. They might have convinced everyone they were happy. And all the while, the distance between them would have grown. The affair had exposed something that already existed. A marriage cannot survive indefinitely on silence. Not even a beautiful marriage. Not even a wealthy marriage. Not even a marriage between two people who love each other. Love needs language. It needs honesty. It needs difficult conversations. And sometimes it needs the courage to say, I'm hurt. I'm afraid. I need you. I don't understand. This isn't working. We need help. Claire had spent most of her life believing those words were signs of weakness. Now she understood they were signs of courage. One evening, months after returning to the bedroom, Claire and Alexander sat on their balcony. The city lights stretched below them. Alexander looked at her. Do you ever think about that night? Claire nodded. Sometimes. What do you remember most? She thought. The silence. He looked at her. Really? Yes. She smiled sadly. I remember standing outside that door and realizing how much of our marriage had been built around things neither of us said. Alexander nodded. I remember hearing Vanessa ask if I was coming home. He looked down. I'm sorry. I know. Claire took his hand. But I don't think that night destroyed us. Alexander looked at her. What did it do? It exposed us. He nodded. And then we had to decide what to do with what we saw. Yes. Claire leaned against the chair. That's what life does sometimes. What? It shows you something you don't want to see. She looked at him. And then it asks whether you're brave enough to change. Alexander smiled. I think I'm finally learning. Claire smiled too. Then they sat quietly. No fear. No secrets. No hidden messages. Just peace. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Silence itself was never the enemy. The problem was what people used silence to hide. There was a silence born from fear. A silence born from shame. A silence born from avoidance. And then there was the silence that came after two people had finally told each other the truth. That silence wasn't empty. It was calm. It was earned. And for Claire and Alexander, it became the beginning of a different kind of love. Not perfect. Not guaranteed. But honest. And sometimes, honest love is the only kind worth rebuilding. 6 months after Claire moved back into the master bedroom, something unexpected happened. She stopped checking the clock when Alexander was late. Not because she didn't care. Because she trusted herself. That distinction had taken months to understand. In the past, if Alexander was 15 minutes late, Claire would have stared at her phone. 30 minutes became a question. An hour became fear. 2 hours became silence. She would tell herself not to worry, while her mind created possibilities she was too afraid to speak aloud. Now, when Alexander was late, she didn't immediately assume anything. She simply waited. And if the delay mattered, he called. That was what trust looked like now. Not blind faith. Not pretending betrayal couldn't happen again. It was knowing that if something went wrong, she would face it with a voice she had finally learned to use. Their marriage had changed, but so had Claire. She was no longer the woman who organized her entire life around Alexander's schedule. She had expanded her work with the foundation. She had accepted a position on the board of an educational initiative. She traveled more. She spent weekends with Maya. She had returned to painting, something she hadn't done since college. and she had discovered that there were parts of herself she had abandoned without realizing it. One Saturday morning, Claire sat in the sunroom with a canvas in front of her. Alexander walked in. He stopped behind her. "What is that?" Claire glanced over her shoulder. "A painting." "I can see that." She smiled. "Then why did you ask?" "I don't know." He studied the canvas. It was abstract. Deep lines crossing one another. Some areas were dark, others were bright. "What does it mean?" Claire looked at it. "I'm not sure yet." Alexander smiled. "That's very you." "What does that mean?" "You always want things to have an answer." Claire laughed. "That's not true." "It is." She looked at him. "You once spent 3 hours trying to figure out why the hotel room television wasn't working. It was broken. You still blamed yourself. I like knowing why things happen." Claire nodded. "Maybe that's why you struggled so much with us." Alexander's smile faded. "Because there wasn't always a reason?" "Because sometimes there was." She turned back to the painting. "And sometimes the reason was simply that we weren't talking." He nodded. "Fair." He walked around the chair. "Do you want coffee?" "Yes." "Anything else?" "No." He started walking away. Then Claire said, "Alexander?" He turned. "Thank you." "For what?" "For asking." He smiled. "I can make coffee without asking." "I know." She smiled. "But I like that you ask." He nodded. "I'll keep asking." Small moments like that had become the language of their new marriage. Not grand declarations, not dramatic promises. Questions, listening, checking in, respecting boundaries. Sometimes love was rebuilt in such ordinary ways that nobody watching from the outside would recognize it. But Claire did. She recognized it because she knew what absence felt like. She knew what emotional neglect felt like. She knew what it meant to sit beside someone and feel completely alone. Now, she could feel the difference. That evening, Maya came over for dinner. She had been one of the few people who had stayed close to Claire through the entire ordeal. They sat around the kitchen island while Alexander cooked. Maya watched him cut vegetables. "You actually learned how to cook." Alexander looked at her. "I always knew how." Claire laughed. "No, you didn't." Maya grinned. "I like him better now." Alexander pointed the knife toward her. "Careful." Maya laughed. Claire watched them. There was something comforting about seeing her best friend and her husband joking together again. But Maya noticed something. She always did. Later, when Alexander went upstairs, Maya looked at Claire. "Are you happy?" Claire knew the question wasn't casual. She put down her glass. "Yes." "Really?" "Yes." Maya studied her. "Not just because things are better." "No." "Then why?" Claire thought. "Because I don't feel afraid anymore." Maya nodded. "That's different." "Very." "Do you trust him?" Claire hesitated. "More." "That's not what I asked." Claire smiled. "I trust him enough to keep choosing him." Maya raised an eyebrow. "That's a very careful answer." "It is." "Why?" "Because trust isn't something I give once." Claire paused. "It's something I watch people earn repeatedly." Maya smiled. "Good." Claire looked toward the stairs. "I love him. I know. I really do." "I know. But I don't need him." Maya smiled. "That's the part I like." Claire nodded. For years, she had thought needing someone was proof of love. Now she understood that love was healthier when it came from choice rather than fear. She wanted Alexander. She didn't need him to survive. That changed everything. A few days later, Alexander received an invitation to a private dinner with several influential investors. Claire was invited too. The event was at an exclusive Manhattan club. Claire almost declined. She didn't enjoy rooms where people whispered behind expensive smiles, but she went. As they entered the ballroom, Alexander leaned toward her. "You okay?" "Yes." "Want to leave?" "No." He smiled. "You're sure?" "Yes." They moved through the crowd. People greeted Alexander. Some congratulated him on recent business success. Others asked about the foundation. Claire stood beside him. Then a man approached. "Alexander." They shook hands. "Good to see you." "You too." The man glanced at Claire. "Your wife?" Alexander smiled. "Claire." The man extended his hand. "Pleasure. Nice to meet you." They spoke for several minutes. Then the man said something that made Claire pause. "You two are lucky." Claire looked at him. "Why?" "Most couples at this level don't survive this long." The man laughed. Alexander smiled politely. Claire said nothing, but the words stayed with her. They had survived. But survival wasn't enough. She didn't want a marriage that merely survived. She wanted one that lived. That night, when they returned home, Claire removed her earrings. Alexander watched her from the doorway. "What are you thinking?" She looked at him. "About what he said tonight." "Who?" "That man at the dinner." Alexander nodded. "About us surviving." He waited. "I don't want us to survive." Alexander looked confused. "I want us to live." He smiled. "I think we're doing that." Claire nodded. "I think so too." Then she looked at him seriously. "But I don't want us to become complacent." "We won't." "You can't promise that." Alexander smiled. "You're right." Claire laughed. "Good." They sat on the edge of the bed. Alexander looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Do you still think about leaving?" Claire considered the question. "Sometimes." His face changed. "Why?" "Because I remember what happened." He nodded. "But not because I want to punish you." "I understand. Sometimes I wonder who I would have become if I had left." Alexander was quiet. "Do you regret staying?" Claire thought. "No." "Why?" "Because I chose to stay." She looked at him. "That's different." Alexander nodded. "Yes." Claire took his hand. "But if I ever stay because I'm afraid to leave, then something is wrong." He squeezed her fingers gently. "I'll remind you." She smiled. "No." He looked surprised. "I'll remind myself." Alexander nodded. That was another difference. Claire no longer expected Alexander to be responsible for her boundaries. She was. She had learned that love did not mean handing someone else the keys to your emotional safety. You could trust someone deeply and still maintain your own identity. You could build a life together without making that person the entire foundation of your life. That was something Claire wanted other women to understand, and perhaps something she needed to remind herself. A few weeks later, Claire received an unexpected phone call. It was from a young woman named Elise. Claire didn't know her. "Hello? Mrs. Whitmore?" "Yes?" "My name is Elise Carter." Claire sat down. "How can I help you?" "I got your number from the foundation." "Okay." Elise's voice trembled. "I need advice." Claire listened. "My husband cheated on me." Claire became still. Elise continued. "I found out 3 months ago. I'm sorry. He says he regrets it." Claire didn't interrupt. "He says he wants another chance." Claire looked toward the window. "And what do you want?" "I don't know." Claire nodded. That answer was familiar. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Are you afraid of leaving him?" "Yes." "Are you afraid of staying?" A long silence. "Yes." Claire closed her eyes. "Then don't decide today." Elise was quiet. "Don't let fear make the decision for you." "What should I do?" "Get honest with yourself first." "How?" "Ask yourself whether you want him back, or whether you're afraid of being without him." Elise began crying. Claire softened. "They aren't the same thing." "I love him." "I believe you." "Then shouldn't I forgive him?" "No." Elise went silent. Claire continued. "You can forgive someone without staying with them." "But what if he changes?" "Then let his change exist whether or not you return." "What do you mean?" "If he's genuinely changing, he won't need you to prove it immediately." Claire paused. "Watch his actions." Elise sniffled. "That's what you did?" "Yes." "And?" Claire smiled faintly. "Sometimes people really do change. But sometimes they only change because they're afraid of losing you." Elise was quiet. "How do you tell the difference?" Claire thought. "Time." She looked down at her hands. "Promises are easy when someone is scared. Consistency is harder." Elise breathed deeply. "Thank you." "You're welcome." After the call ended, Claire sat silently. Alexander walked in. Who was that? Someone who needed advice. He didn't ask for details. Claire appreciated that. He poured himself water. Then she said, "Do you know what I realized?" "What?" "I don't want my pain to be wasted." Alexander looked at her. "What do you mean?" "If everything I went through only made me bitter, then the pain won." He nodded. "So, I want to use what I learned." "How?" "To help people." Alexander smiled. "You already do." "More personally." He looked at her. "You'd be good at that." Claire smiled. "Maybe." She turned toward him. "And maybe that's part of why I stayed." Alexander's expression became serious. "Because of me?" "No." Claire shook her head. "Because I wanted to understand what happened." She paused. "And now I do." Alexander waited. "Sometimes people hurt each other because they don't know how to communicate." She looked at him. Sometimes they hurt each other because they are selfish. And sometimes both are true. Alexander nodded. Yes. Claire smiled. That's what I want to teach. What? That love doesn't excuse bad behavior. Yes. That forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Yes. That communication isn't optional. Yes. And that choosing yourself doesn't mean you don't love someone. Alexander smiled. I think that's a good lesson. It took me long enough to learn it. He took her hand. Some lessons take time. Claire looked at him. Some cost a lot. He nodded. I know. That evening, they sat together on the balcony. The city glowed below them. Alexander looked at Claire. I love you. She smiled. I love you too. He waited. Can I kiss you? Claire looked at him. The question was simple, but it represented everything they had learned. Permission, respect, choice. Claire smiled. Yes. He kissed her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't desperate. It was gentle. When they separated, Claire rested her forehead against his. For the first time, the closeness didn't frighten her. Because she knew she could say no. And because she knew he would listen. That was what made saying yes meaningful. Love was not the absence of boundaries. Healthy love respected them. Claire closed her eyes. She realized that she hadn't lost herself by choosing Alexander again. She had found herself first. And that was why she could choose him now without fear. But there was still one final question hanging over their future. Could two people who had once built a marriage around silence truly create a relationship where honesty remained stronger than fear? They were about to find out, because the hardest test of their new marriage wasn't going to come from another woman. It was going to come from life itself. Life did not wait for Claire and Alexander to become ready. It never did. Just when they had begun to settle into the rhythm of their new marriage, Alexander received a phone call that changed everything. It was 6:40 on a Wednesday morning. Claire was downstairs making coffee when she heard Alexander's phone ring upstairs. A few minutes later, he came into the kitchen. His face was different. Not angry, not frightened, serious. Claire immediately noticed. What happened? Alexander pulled out a chair. My father died. Claire froze. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Alexander's father had been ill for months, but he had never talked much about it. She walked toward him. I'm sorry. He nodded. I just got the call. Claire sat beside him. Do you want me to come with you? Alexander looked at her. Yes. That single word told her everything. He didn't need to be strong that morning. He needed his wife. They flew to Connecticut that afternoon. The funeral was private. Alexander stood beside the grave while people spoke about his father's accomplishments. Successful businessman, generous donor, visionary, strong leader. Everyone described the man they had known publicly. Nobody talked about the father Alexander had known privately. The man who rarely hugged him. The man who believed emotions were weaknesses. The man who taught his son that failure was unacceptable. After the service, Alexander remained alone near the grave. Claire stood several feet away. She didn't interrupt. She had learned that sometimes support didn't mean speaking. Sometimes it meant staying close enough that someone knew they weren't alone. After several minutes, Alexander looked toward her. She walked over. He stared at the grave. I thought I would feel angry. Claire said nothing. I thought I'd finally get to say everything I never said. He swallowed. But now he's gone. Claire reached for his hand. Alexander held it tightly. I spent my whole life trying to prove him wrong. About what? That I was weak. Claire looked at him. And did you? Alexander shook his head. No. He looked at the grave. I became exactly what he taught me to be. Claire's eyes softened. No. He looked at her. You became what you thought you had to become. She paused. But you don't have to stay that way. Alexander's eyes filled. I don't know how to grieve. Claire squeezed his hand. You don't have to know. He looked at her. Can I cry? Claire smiled through her own tears. You don't need permission. That was the first time Claire saw Alexander completely break down. He leaned against her. And she held him. Not because she was responsible for fixing his pain. Because she loved him. There was a difference. She didn't tell him to be strong. She didn't tell him everything would be okay. She simply stayed. For the next several days, Alexander struggled. He became quiet. He stopped working. He spent hours looking through old photographs. Claire gave him space. But she also checked on him. Have you eaten? No. Come downstairs. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he didn't. And Claire didn't take his withdrawal personally. She understood that grief could make people retreat. But she also knew the difference between needing space and shutting someone out. One evening, She knocked on his study door. "Can I come in?" He looked up. "Yes." She sat across from him. "You haven't spoken to me much today." "I know. Are you okay?" "No." Claire nodded. "Thank you for saying that." Alexander looked at her. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." "Whatever you're feeling." "I feel angry." "That's okay." "I feel guilty." "That's okay too." "I feel relieved." Claire remained quiet. Alexander looked ashamed. "I shouldn't feel relieved." "Why?" "Because he's dead." Claire shook her head. "Relief doesn't mean you didn't love him." Alexander looked at her. "It means you were carrying something heavy." He looked down. Claire continued. "You can grieve someone and still acknowledge that they hurt you." Alexander nodded. "That's what you did with me." Claire thought about it. "Yes." "How?" "I stopped pretending you were only one thing." Alexander looked confused. "What do you mean?" "You hurt me." She paused. "But you also loved me." "You betrayed me." "But you also changed. You made terrible choices. But you are trying to become better." Claire looked directly at him. "People can contain contradictions." Alexander nodded slowly. "That's difficult." "Very." They sat in silence. Then Alexander said, "I don't want to become my father." Claire smiled gently. "Then don't." "I'm afraid I already did." "No." She shook her head. "You know what makes you different?" "What?" "You are aware." She leaned forward. "You are asking questions he never asked. You are admitting things he never admitted. You are learning things he refused to learn." Claire smiled. "That's how patterns end." Alexander's eyes filled. "Do you think people can really change?" Claire thought about it. "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because I changed." He smiled. "So did I." She nodded. The funeral changed something in their relationship. Not dramatically. Quietly. Alexander became more emotionally open. He talked about his father. He admitted when he was overwhelmed. He asked for help. He stopped pretending he could handle everything alone. Claire noticed, and she respected it. But then, life presented another challenge. 3 months later, Alexander received an offer to expand Whitmore Global overseas. It would require him to spend several months in Europe. The old Alexander would have accepted immediately. The new Alexander brought the offer home. "I want your opinion." Claire looked at the proposal. "Do you want it?" "Yes." "Then why are you asking me?" "Because it affects both of us." Claire nodded. "How long?" 4 months. She became quiet. 4 months. The word brought back memories. Business trips. Late nights. Distance. Vanessa. Claire felt the old fear rise, but she didn't hide it. "I'm scared." Alexander looked at her. "Of what?" "Of going back." He nodded. "I understand. I don't want to become the woman who waits for your calls again." "I don't want that either." "What do we do?" Alexander thought. "We make a plan." Claire smiled. "Okay." They talked for hours. Video calls. Scheduled visits. Clear expectations. No disappearing. No unexplained changes. No emotional withdrawal. And most importantly, they agreed that if either person became unhappy, they would speak immediately. Not after months. Not after another person entered the picture. Immediately. Alexander accepted the opportunity. The first month was difficult. Claire missed him. He missed her. But the difference was communication. Every evening, they talked. Sometimes for 10 minutes. Sometimes for an hour. If Alexander was exhausted, he said so. If Claire was lonely, she said so. If either was upset, they addressed it. One evening, Claire said, "I hate this." Alexander smiled. "I know. I miss you. I miss you too. I'm angry that you're enjoying yourself." He laughed. "I am enjoying myself. I know, but I miss you." Claire smiled. "Good answer." He laughed. The distance didn't destroy them. It strengthened something they had once lacked. Trust through consistency. 4 months later, Alexander returned home. Claire waited at the airport. When he saw her, he smiled. She walked toward him. He dropped his suitcase. They hugged. It wasn't desperate. It was joyful. "You look good," he said. "You look tired." "I am. Good." He laughed. They walked toward the car. On the drive home, Claire looked at him. "You know what?" "What?" "We survived 4 months." "We did. Without lying." He smiled. "That's a pretty low standard." She laughed. "It is." Then she became serious. "But it's important." He nodded. When they arrived home, Claire walked into the kitchen. Everything looked familiar. The same counters, the same windows, the same coffee machine. But the house felt different, because they were different. That evening, they sat on the balcony. Alexander looked at Claire. "I used to think marriage meant knowing everything about each other." Claire smiled. "Now? Now I think it means being willing to keep learning each other." She nodded. "That's better." He reached for her hand. "I don't want to lose you again." Claire looked at him. "Then don't stop talking." "I won't. And don't assume silence means everything is okay." "I won't. And don't ever decide what I can handle without asking me." Alexander nodded. "I promise." Claire smiled. "That's enough." They sat quietly. Then Claire looked toward the city. She thought about the woman who had stood outside the bedroom door months earlier. That woman had believed her life was ending. In some ways, it had. But something else had begun. A stronger version of herself. A clearer understanding of love. A deeper respect for boundaries. She finally understood that she didn't need to choose between being loving and being strong. She could be both. She could forgive and still remember. She could trust and still maintain boundaries. She could love Alexander and still choose herself. That was the balance she had spent her whole life searching for. And perhaps that was the real lesson of everything they had endured. Healthy love was not about disappearing into another person. It was about standing beside them without abandoning yourself. Months later, Claire began speaking at women's leadership events. She didn't tell the full story. She didn't reveal private details. But she talked about emotional communication, about boundaries, about self-worth, about how people sometimes stay silent because they fear what honesty might cost. At one event, someone asked her, "What's the biggest lesson you've learned about love?" Claire thought for a moment, then smiled. "Love isn't proven by how much pain you're willing to tolerate." The room became quiet. She continued, "Love is proven by how willing two people are to tell the truth, listen to each other, and take responsibility when they cause harm." Someone asked, "And what if trust is broken?" Claire answered, "Then don't rush it." She paused. "Trust should be rebuilt slowly enough that you can see whether the change is real." The audience listened. "And remember this." Claire looked around the room. "Forgiveness is a gift you can give yourself. Reconciliation is a choice you make with another person. They are not the same thing." The room erupted in applause. Claire smiled. She had once thought her greatest lesson would come from losing Alexander. Instead, it came from finding herself. That night, she returned home. Alexander was waiting in the kitchen. "How was the event?" "Good. What did you talk about?" "Love." He smiled. "Of course." Claire walked toward him. "And you? What? What did you learn today?" He thought, "That my wife is much smarter than me." Claire laughed. "That's not new." "I know." He kissed her forehead, then asked, "Are you happy?" Claire looked at him. She didn't answer immediately. She thought about the girl on the staircase, the woman outside the bedroom, the wife who had removed her wedding ring, the woman who had slowly learned to speak. Then she smiled. Yes. Not because her life was perfect. Not because Alexander could never hurt her again. Not because the past had disappeared. She was happy because she no longer needed perfection to feel safe. She trusted herself. And that was enough. But one final conversation remained. The one where Claire would decide once and for all what the rest of their story would look like. Not as the woman who had been betrayed. Not as the wife of a billionaire. Not as the woman who had learned to survive silence. But simply as Claire. A woman who had finally learned that choosing herself didn't mean choosing against love. Sometimes it meant learning how to love without losing yourself. 2 years after Claire came home early, she woke before Alexander. The room was still dark. A thin line of morning light rested beneath the curtains. She lay quietly for a moment, listening to his breathing. There was a time when silence in a bedroom frightened her. Silence meant secrets. Silence meant distance. Silence meant something was wrong. Now, silence meant something completely different. Peace. Claire turned toward Alexander. He was asleep on his back, one hand resting loosely beside him. She smiled, not because she had forgotten what happened, because she remembered it without feeling consumed by it. That was healing. Not forgetting, not pretending, remembering without being controlled by the memory. She slipped out of bed and walked downstairs. The kitchen was cool and quiet. She started the coffee machine. Then she opened the back door. Morning air entered the room. Claire stepped outside. The garden had changed over the years. New flowers, new trees. A small stone path Alexander had built himself. She smiled when she remembered how badly he had handled the first attempt. He had spent an entire Saturday trying to build the path. By evening, it was crooked. Claire had laughed for nearly 10 minutes. He had been offended. Then they had both laughed. Those ordinary moments had become their favorite memories. Not expensive vacations, not red carpets, not business celebrations, ordinary mornings, burnt dinners, long walks, arguments that ended with conversations instead of silence. Those were the things that made their marriage feel real. Claire heard footsteps behind her. Alexander stepped outside, holding 2 cups. "You left without me." She turned. "I thought you were sleeping." "I was." He handed her a cup. "Then I woke up." She smiled. "Thank you." They stood beside each other. The sun slowly rose over the city. Alexander looked at her. "What are you thinking?" Claire smiled. "About how different everything feels." "Good different?" "Very." He nodded. "I was thinking about something too." "What?" "Today is 2 years." Claire looked at him. "Since I came home early?" "Yes." She looked away. "I don't like remembering that night." "I know, but I don't hate remembering it anymore." Alexander looked at her. "Why?" "Because if it hadn't happened, we might never have learned how broken we were." He nodded. "I wish we had learned another way." "So do I." They remained quiet. Then Alexander asked, "Do you regret staying?" Claire thought about the question. "No." He looked relieved. "But I don't regret almost leaving either." That surprised him. "Why?" "Because I needed to know I could." Alexander nodded. "That's fair." Claire took a sip of coffee. "I think that's something people misunderstand." "What?" "Sometimes, knowing you can leave is what allows you to stay freely." Alexander looked at her. "Because you aren't trapped." "Exactly." She turned toward him. "I stayed because I wanted to. Not because she was afraid. Not because of money. Not because of reputation. Not because they had been married for years. Because she chose him." That distinction mattered. Alexander reached for her hand. "I'll never take that for granted." Claire smiled. "I hope not." They went inside. Later that morning, Claire found an envelope on the kitchen counter. She looked at Alexander. "What is this?" "Open it." She did. Inside was a photograph. Their first photograph together. Chicago, the charity event. The night they met. Claire smiled. "You kept this?" "Yes." There was a handwritten note behind it. She turned it over. Alexander had written, "I spent years believing love was something you found. I learned that love is something you practice." Claire read it twice, then looked at him. "When did you become sentimental?" "Marriage." She laughed. He smiled. "There's something else." He reached into his pocket. This time, he pulled out a small velvet box. Claire stared at it. "Alexander, relax." He smiled. "I'm not proposing." She laughed. "You've said that before." "I know." He opened the box. Inside was her wedding ring. The original ring. The one she had removed 2 years earlier. Claire stared at it. "I thought you kept it in the drawer." "I did." "Why do you have it?" "Because I wanted to ask you something." Claire became still. He took the ring out. "I don't want you to wear this because you're my wife." She looked at him. "I don't want you to wear it because you forgave me." He paused. "I don't want you to wear it because we survived." Claire's eyes filled. "Then why?" "Because if you choose to wear it again, I want it to mean that you're choosing this life freely." He held the ring out. "You don't have to." Claire looked at the ring. Then, at Alexander. She didn't answer immediately. He waited. He didn't pressure her, didn't plead, didn't promise. He simply waited. Claire took the ring. She held it between her fingers. 2 years earlier, that ring had represented everything she feared losing. Now it represented something different. Choice. She slipped it onto her finger. Alexander's eyes filled. Claire smiled. "I'm choosing you." He exhaled slowly. "But I'm also choosing me." He nodded. "I know. And if we ever stop communicating, we talk. If we ever become distant, we talk. If either of us becomes unhappy, well, we talk." She smiled. "You'd better." "I will." They embraced. There was no dramatic music, no audience, no cameras. Just 2 people in a quiet kitchen. And that was exactly how Claire wanted it. Because the love they had rebuilt was no longer for other people's approval. It belonged to them. That afternoon, they went for a walk. They passed the cafe where they had once spent an entire afternoon arguing about whether they should move to New York. Claire laughed at the memory. "You wanted Chicago. You wanted New York. And? You won. I usually do." Alexander laughed. They kept walking. At one point, Claire stopped. What? She looked at him. I want to tell you something. He waited. I'm glad you cheated. Alexander's face changed. What? She smiled. Not because it was right. I know, but because it forced the truth out. He nodded slowly. I understand. Without that night, I might still be living quietly. She paused. Maybe I would still be afraid to ask questions. Alexander looked at her. Maybe. And maybe you would still be pretending you were fine. Probably. Claire smiled. So I'm not grateful for the betrayal. She took his hand. I'm grateful for what we did after it. Alexander squeezed her fingers. Me too. They walked again. The city moved around them. People hurried past. Cars moved through intersections. A woman laughed on a nearby bench. A father pushed a stroller. A couple argued playfully over where to eat. Life continued. It always did. And Claire understood something. A painful chapter didn't have to become the whole story. Sometimes, the worst moment in your life became the moment that forced you to change direction. Sometimes betrayal taught you boundaries. Sometimes heartbreak taught you honesty. Sometimes losing trust taught you how to trust yourself. That evening, Claire and Alexander hosted a small dinner. Maya came, so did Claire's mother. The table was full. There was laughter, stories, food. At one point, Evelyn looked at her daughter. Claire smiled. Her mother understood. After dinner, Evelyn pulled Claire aside. You look happy. I am. Really? Really? Evelyn smiled. I'm proud of you. Claire hugged her. Thank you. Her mother whispered, You found your voice. Claire smiled. I think I did. And you kept your heart. Claire looked toward Alexander. That too. Later, after everyone left, Claire and Alexander cleaned the kitchen together. Claire washed. Alexander dried, just like they had done years earlier. The difference was that now they talked about everything, about nothing, about tomorrow, about next year, about growing old. Alexander handed her a plate. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come home early? Claire looked at him. All the time. What do you think? I think we would have continued pretending. He nodded. Probably. Maybe for years. Maybe. She placed the plate into the sink. And eventually, one of us would have become too tired to pretend. Alexander nodded. Probably you. Claire smiled. Probably. They laughed. Then, Alexander became quiet. I'm sorry. Claire looked at him. For what? For making you spend so much time learning lessons you shouldn't have had to learn. Claire stepped closer. You don't get to rewrite the past. I know, but you can honor it. How? By never wasting what it taught us. He nodded. She touched his face. That's enough. They stood there. Quiet, still, together. And this time, the silence didn't need explanation. It didn't hide anything. It didn't threaten anything. It simply existed, peacefully, like two people who no longer needed to fill every empty space with words because they knew the truth between them. Claire looked at Alexander. I love you. I love you too. Then she smiled. But I'm still better at cooking. Alexander laughed. Absolutely not. She laughed. The argument continued. Playfully, naturally. Life had returned. Not the life they had before. Something better. Something more honest. Something built intentionally. And as they turned off the kitchen lights and walked upstairs together, Claire understood the final lesson. The greatest danger in a relationship isn't always the person who speaks too much. Sometimes it's what two people refuse to say. Unspoken hurt becomes resentment. Unspoken fear becomes distance. Unspoken loneliness becomes disconnection. Unspoken truth becomes betrayal. But the opposite is also true. Spoken pain can become understanding. Spoken fear can become intimacy. Spoken boundaries can become respect. And spoken truth can become the beginning of peace. Claire had once believed silence was safety. Now she knew better. Silence could be safety, but only when the truth had already been spoken. That night, she climbed into bed beside Alexander. He turned toward her. Good night. Good night. The room went dark. They didn't speak again. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire didn't need to, because she knew exactly where she stood. She was loved. She was heard. She was respected. And most importantly, she was free to choose. That was what made the silence peaceful. Not the absence of words. The absence of fear. The following morning, Claire woke to sunlight spilling across the bedroom floor. For a few seconds, she remained still. She listened. The house was quiet. But this time, The quiet didn't make her anxious. There was no unanswered question waiting somewhere behind a closed door. No secret phone call. No unexplained absence. No message she was afraid to read. Just morning. Just sunlight. Just the sound of Alexander moving around downstairs. Claire smiled. She got out of bed and walked downstairs. Alexander was in the kitchen. He was attempting to make breakfast. She stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing?" He looked over his shoulder. "Breakfast." Claire stared at the pan. "That looks dangerous." "It's pancakes." "They're black." He looked down. "Oh." Claire laughed. "You've been married to me this long, and still haven't learned." "I've learned plenty. Apparently not how to cook." He smiled. "Come here." She walked over. He handed her the spatula. "Save them." She shook her head. "Some things can't be saved." They laughed. It was a simple moment, but Claire treasured it, because she understood something now. The opposite of betrayal wasn't perfection. It was presence. Alexander was present. He was there, not just physically, emotionally. When she spoke, he listened. When he struggled, he told her. When they disagreed, they stayed. When something hurt, they addressed it. They had stopped treating difficult conversations as threats. They had started treating them as maintenance, like repairing a crack before it became a broken wall. That afternoon, Claire sat in her office preparing a speech. The foundation had asked her to speak at a National Women's Leadership Conference. She had originally planned to decline. Then she changed her mind. She wanted to tell her story. Not the details, not the scandal, not the names, the lesson. She wanted women to understand something she had learned painfully. Silence could protect you for a season. But if you made it your permanent language, it could eventually isolate you from the people you loved. Claire opened her laptop. She began writing, then stopped. She stared at the blank page. The first sentence was difficult. Finally she typed, "There was a time when I believed being quiet made me strong." She continued, "I thought if I stayed calm, patient, understanding and forgiving, I could keep my marriage safe." She paused, then added, "I was wrong." Claire leaned back. The truth felt strangely freeing. She continued writing. She wrote about emotional distance, about how people sometimes notice a problem long before they admit it, about how couples can live in the same house and become strangers, about how fear can turn conversations into silence, about how silence can eventually become resentment, and about how betrayal often exposes problems that were already being ignored. But Claire made one thing clear: a failing relationship never justified betrayal. Poor communication could explain distance. It could never excuse dishonesty. She wrote that, too. Then she added something else. You are allowed to take responsibility for your part, without taking responsibility for someone else's choices. She stared at the sentence. That was perhaps the hardest lesson she had learned. For a long time, Claire had believed that if she had been more affectionate, more available, more understanding, more adventurous, more patient, perhaps Alexander wouldn't have cheated. But that wasn't true. She could acknowledge that she had withdrawn. She could admit that she had stopped communicating. She could recognize that she had allowed loneliness to become normal. But Alexander had still made his own choice, and understanding that distinction had freed her from unnecessary guilt. That evening, she read the speech to Alexander. He sat quietly while she spoke. When she finished, he didn't say anything immediately. Claire looked at him. "What?" He smiled. "It's good." "That's all?" "No." He stood. "It's honest." Claire smiled. "That's what I wanted." "You should give it." She nodded. "I will." The next morning, Claire stood on a stage before hundreds of people. She looked across the audience. Women of different ages, different backgrounds, different stories. Some married, some divorced, some single, some carrying pain nobody knew about. Claire took a breath. There are things we don't say because we're afraid of what will happen when we say them. The room became quiet. We don't say, "I'm lonely," because we're afraid someone will think we're blaming them. She paused. We don't say, "I'm hurt," because we're afraid we'll sound weak. Another pause. We don't say, "I'm unhappy," because we don't know what comes after the truth. She looked around the room. "But I learned something." Her voice became steadier. "The truth doesn't destroy healthy relationships." She paused. "Silence does." The audience remained completely still. Claire continued. "Not every relationship should be saved." That sentence caused a ripple of attention. "And not every relationship should end." She smiled gently. "But every relationship deserves honesty." She spoke about boundaries, about accountability, about forgiveness, about communication, and then she said the words that had taken her years to understand. Choosing yourself doesn't mean you don't love someone. Sometimes it is the first step toward learning how to love without losing yourself. The room erupted in applause. Claire stood quietly for a moment. She didn't feel proud because people were applauding. She felt proud because the woman who once couldn't say "I'm hurt" was now standing in front of hundreds of people, teaching others to use their voices. That was her transformation. Not that she had become fearless. She hadn't. She had simply stopped allowing fear to make every decision. After the event, Claire walked outside. Alexander was waiting. He had flown in that morning. She smiled when she saw him. "You came." "Of course. What did you think?" "I think you should have charged admission." She laughed. "Seriously?" He smiled. "Seriously?" "Yes. I thought you were incredible." Claire looked down. "Thank you." He stepped closer. "I'm proud of you." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you didn't become bitter." Claire smiled. "I almost did." "I know. You helped." He shook his head. "You did the work." She considered that. "Maybe." "No." He smiled. "You did." They walked toward the car. Claire slipped her hand into his, and she realized something. She didn't need Alexander to validate her healing, but it was beautiful that he could witness it. There was a difference. A healthy relationship didn't complete you. It accompanied you. It didn't become your identity. It became part of your life. That evening, they returned home. Claire removed her shoes and walked into the living room. She looked around. The house had changed over the years. Some furniture had been replaced. Some photographs had been removed. New memories had taken the place of old ones. But one photograph remained. Their wedding photograph. Claire looked at it. Alexander stood beside her. "Do you still like that picture?" She smiled. "Yes." "Why?" "Because we were happy." He looked at her. "We were. But we didn't know what we didn't know." He nodded. "True." Claire touched the frame. "I don't want to erase that version of us." "Why?" "Because they were doing the best they could." She looked at Alexander. "So are we." He smiled. "That's fair." They went upstairs. Claire changed into comfortable clothes. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "If we could go back to the night you came home early, would you do anything differently?" Claire thought about it. "Yes." "What?" "I would knock." Alexander laughed softly. "You would?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I would want to hear the truth directly." He nodded. "And after?" "I would still leave the room." "Why?" "Because I would need space." He smiled. "Fair." Claire looked at him. "What about you?" "If I could go back?" "Yes." Alexander's expression became serious. "I would tell you I was unhappy." "Before Vanessa?" "Before anyone." Claire nodded. "And then?" "I would ask you to help me." She smiled sadly. "That's all you had to do." "I know." He looked down. "That's what I regret most." "Not Vanessa." "No." He shook his head. "I regret the months when I was sitting across from you, wanting you to understand me, while refusing to tell you what I needed." Claire's eyes softened. "That was the tragedy." "What?" "We were both lonely." He looked at her. "And both waiting." "Yes." She smiled. "That's why I don't want us to ever do that again." "We won't." This time, the promise felt different. Not because promises had become trustworthy again, because the promise was supported by years of changed behavior. That was the difference. Words had become meaningful only after actions gave them weight. Later that night, they turned off the lights. Claire lay beside Alexander. The room was dark. He reached for her hand. She took it. Neither spoke. The silence settled around them. And Claire smiled, because the silence was no longer a warning. It was proof. They didn't have to fill every second. They didn't have to explain every feeling immediately. They didn't have to perform happiness. They could simply exist beside each other. And that was peace. Not perfect peace. Not permanent peace. Real peace. The kind that still allowed disagreement. The kind that still allowed sadness. The kind that didn't require pretending. Claire closed her eyes. She thought about the title that had once seemed like the cruelest sentence imaginable. She had come home early. Her billionaire husband and his mistress had never looked up. That night had changed everything. But perhaps the deepest irony was this. The woman who had entered that house afraid that she had lost her husband eventually discovered that she had found something more important. She had found herself. And when she found herself, she stopped begging love to stay. She stopped measuring her worth by another person's choices. She stopped confusing patience with endurance. She stopped confusing forgiveness with permission. She stopped confusing silence with strength. She learned to speak. She learned to listen. She learned to walk away when necessary. And eventually, she learned something even harder. She learned that she could choose to stay without surrendering herself. That was what made their reconciliation meaningful. It wasn't a return to the old marriage. It was the creation of a new one. A marriage where silence had a different meaning, where a quiet room no longer meant secrets, where a late night didn't automatically mean betrayal, where two people could sit beside each other without speaking because there was nothing they were afraid to say. Claire opened her eyes. Alexander? Yes? Are you awake? Yes. She smiled. I love you. There was a pause. I love you too. She closed her eyes again. And this time, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of everything they had finally learned to say. Full of forgiveness. Full of boundaries. Full of trust earned slowly. Full of two people who understood that love wasn't measured by how long you could remain silent. It was measured by how courageous you were willing to be when silence was no longer enough. And as morning approached, Claire slept peacefully beside the man who had once broken her heart. Not because she had forgotten, not because she was naive, not because she believed betrayal could never happen again, but because she had finally understood the most important truth of all. She could love someone deeply without ever abandoning herself again, and that was the kind of love worth choosing. The kind that didn't demand silence, the kind that welcomed truth, the kind that allowed two imperfect people to become better without pretending they had never been broken. Outside, the city began to wake. Inside, Claire remained still. Alexander's hand rested gently in hers. And for once, silence wasn't distance. It wasn't fear. It wasn't a secret. It was simply peace. Before you leave, I want you to think about one question. If Claire had never come home early, would she and Alexander ever have faced the truth about their marriage? Sometimes, the most painful moments in our lives expose truths we've been too afraid to speak. Claire learned that silence can protect a relationship for a moment, but if it becomes a habit, it can create a distance that love alone cannot cross. She also learned something even more important. Forgiving someone doesn't mean forgetting what they did. Choosing to stay doesn't mean abandoning yourself. And loving someone doesn't mean accepting everything they do to you. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is having the courage to tell the truth. So tell me, in the comments, do you believe trust can truly be rebuilt after betrayal? Or once someone breaks your trust, should the relationship end permanently? I genuinely want to hear your opinion. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear this message, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more powerful stories about love, betrayal, forgiveness, healing, and the choices that shape our lives. And remember, never be so afraid of losing someone that you lose yourself trying to keep them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.